Hello, dreamers, and welcome to Haunted Sleep. This is the place where eerie tales and calming whispers meet, helping you drift into peaceful sleep with a touch of mystery. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Leave a comment below and let me know. And if you're enjoying these nightly journeys, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a night of chilling calm. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. Me and my boyfriend Kieran had been together for 4 years, and for our anniversary on April 16, 2019, we decided to stay at a hotel to spend some quality time together. Since we rarely got time alone, we thought a short getaway would be perfect. We booked a stay at the Grand Hotel in Swansea and were given room 2.12. When we arrived, everything felt normal. The hotel seemed nice, and the first night passed peacefully. Nothing was out of place, and we were enjoying our stay. It was a happy and relaxing time, until things started to get strange. At first, it was small, almost unnoticeable things. Items in the bathroom seemed to be shifting places. I assumed the hotel staff had moved things around while cleaning. But after a while, I realized the movements weren't random. They were happening even after the maids had already cleaned the room. At first, I ignored it, thinking I was just imagining things, but as the days passed, I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, I told my boyfriend about it. He's someone who doesn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. When I mentioned how things in the bathroom kept moving, he just brushed it off. I explained how the glasses had turned the other way around, how our toothbrushes were shifting, and even how my toiletry bag had been moved multiple times. Kieran just laughed and told me I was probably just forgetting where I put my things. But I knew that wasn't the case. I am extremely particular about keeping things in their proper place, and I never forget how I arrange them. The movements continued, and with each passing day, I grew more uneasy. Then, one night, something happened that shook me to my core. Kieran was asleep, and I was lying in bed, struggling to fall asleep. The room was dark, with only the faintest bit of light coming through the window. As I turned to face the bathroom, I saw something, a face. It wasn't clear, but it was definitely there. The faint outline of a woman's face, watching me from the bathroom door. I froze. For a few moments, I couldn't move. My body tensed, and I felt like I couldn't even breathe. My heart was pounding, and all I could do was stare back at it. It wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. There was someone there. Terrified, I shook Kieran awake. He groggily wrapped his arm around me and told me to go back to sleep without even opening his eyes. I wanted to scream, to make him see what I was seeing, but by the time I gathered the courage to look again, the face was gone. I barely slept that night. A few nights later, something even worse happened. That evening, Kieran and I had a small argument before bed. It wasn't anything serious, just a silly disagreement, but I was furious. I was so upset that I couldn't stand to be in bed next to him, so I stormed into the bathroom, needing to be alone. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at myself in the mirror, my mind racing with frustration. But then, something shifted inside me. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I had a dark, intrusive thought. Imagine how bad he would feel if I hung myself right here. The thought didn't feel like my own. It was as if it had been planted in my mind. I had never thought that way before, but in that moment, the idea felt so real, like something wanted me to think it. I sat there, staring at my reflection, as that thought lingered. I couldn't shake it. The anger, the frustration, the overwhelming urge to act on it, it felt as if something was pushing me toward it. I don't know how long I sat there. It could have been minutes or hours. But at some point, I forced myself to snap out of it and return to bed. The moment I lay down, Kieran, still asleep, mumbled an apology. And just like that, the dark thoughts disappeared. The next morning, something strange happened. Our hotel keycard stopped working. At first, we thought it was just a minor issue, but when we went to the reception, The hotel staff told us that the electronic lock on our room had completely malfunctioned. They had no explanation for why it had stopped working, but they told us we had to switch rooms. The new room was just a few doors down from our old one. But from the moment we moved, everything changed. No objects moved. No strange feelings. No intrusive thoughts. It was completely normal. Still shaken by everything that had happened, I decided to look up the history of the Grand Hotel when we got home. I wasn't expecting to find anything, but what I discovered chilled me to my core. In 2016, a woman named Rachel Phillips had checked into the hotel with her girlfriend. They had argued, and she had hung herself in the bathroom of her room. I had never heard of this incident before. There were no reports of hauntings at the hotel. But when I saw a photo of Rachel, my breath caught in my throat. It was the face I had seen by the bathroom door. I don't know why she showed herself to me, but I truly believe she wanted me to feel what she had felt, the anger, the sorrow, the overwhelming despair. Maybe she needed someone to understand. Maybe she didn't want to be forgotten. I don't have all the answers, but I truly hope that wherever she is now, she has found peace. The house where we raised our children was built in 1907, and with a house that old, it was bound to have a long history. But it wasn't the past that drew us in, it was the charm, the warmth, the feeling of home that made us want to live there. We moved in, thinking we'd found the perfect place to build memories, but we weren't the only ones living there. We realized that very quickly. One morning, after one of our first nights in the house, the kids sat down at the breakfast table and asked why we had been running up and down the stairs all night. My husband and I exchanged looks. We had gone to bed early and had not been out of bed once. But the kids were convinced they had heard footsteps, constant movement on the stairs all through the night. That was the first time we felt something wasn't quite right, but it certainly wasn't the last. For 7 years, we lived in that house, and in those years, there were countless strange occurrences. I was no stranger to the unexplainable, so it didn't bother me as much as it might have scared someone else. I also didn't want to encourage my kids' fears, so whenever something happened, I'd brush it off as just the quirks of an old house. But deep down I knew something else lived there with us. It wasn't long before my husband and I had our first real encounter with our invisible roommate. It was late one night, the kids were fast asleep in their beds, and we had just settled in ourselves when a loud thump echoed from outside our bedroom door. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, as if something had been dropped or something had fallen. Assuming one of the kids was up, maybe sneaking around, my husband threw open the door, expecting to catch one of them in the act. But the hallway was empty. The entire house was still, dark, and silent. He went downstairs to check on the kids, only to find them all tucked in and sound asleep. Another time, I had a friend over, and we were chatting in my bedroom when I noticed something odd. The master bathroom door was shut. That was unusual because the only two people who ever used that bathroom were my husband and me, and neither of us had left it closed. Something about it felt off. I went to open the door and discovered it was locked from the inside. I froze. Someone was in there. I called out, asking who was inside. Silence. I called out again. Still no answer. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the shower curtain shifting. The sound sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to move. I walked over to the closet to grab the key, determined to find out who, or what, was in my bathroom. But by the time I turned back, the door was cracked open. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door wide open and taunted whatever was inside. "Get out of my bathroom!" I said, my voice firm. There was no response, no movement, but the air in the room felt heavy, thick, like something was still lingering there, watching. Incidents like these became a normal part of our lives. My husband and I would sit in the living room watching TV, and we'd hear the back door slam shut. It always happened the same way, just as if one of the kids had come home. We'd yell, "Don't slam the door!" expecting them to respond. But there was never a reply. My husband would go down to check, but the house would be completely empty. No one had come in. Some nights were worse than others. I remember one night in particular, one that still makes my skin crawl to this day. My husband was fast asleep, snoring like a chainsaw, while I lay awake, unable to drift off. Then I felt it, a presence in the room. It wasn't just a feeling, it was something real. I heard shuffling on the carpet. It was faint but distinct, like bare feet dragging across the floor. My heart pounded. I tried nudging my husband, but he wouldn't wake up. I turned onto my side, gripping the blanket tightly and pulling it just below my eyes. I was facing the window, and since it was winter, a draft seeped in through the old glass. I could feel the freezing air on my face. The shuffling sound grew closer. I held my breath. Then, just inches from my face, I heard it, a wet smacking sound, like someone licking their lips. And then, a breath. But not just any breath. It was hot, unnaturally warm, and it brushed against my forehead in stark contrast to the icy draft from the window. My entire body locked up in fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just laid there, waiting for whatever it was to go away. We later decided to renovate the downstairs area, and during the renovation, the frames started leaking. While my husband was outside fixing the leak, we told the kids to stay out of the basement since it was under construction. That day, I was doing laundry in the basement, going up and down the stairs as I switched out loads. And that's when I noticed something strange. Every time I came back, one of the basement bedroom lights was on. I'd turn it off, go back upstairs, and when I returned, it was on again. It kept happening, over and over. Eventually, I got frustrated and went outside to tell everyone to stay out of the basement. But the kids had gone to the playground, and my husband hadn't been inside. No one had touched the lights. And then there were the certificates. We had to complete a course to get our house refinanced, and after finishing it, we were mailed our certificates of completion. I put them in a designated spot where I kept all important papers. Every day, I saw them right where I had left them. Then, one day, we needed to present them. My husband asked me to grab them, and when I went to get them, they were gone. I knew they had been there. I saw them every single day. But they had vanished. I tore the house apart looking for them, doubting myself, questioning my own memory. But I knew I hadn't moved them. We gave up looking and ordered a new set. A week later, the replacements arrived. I put them in the exact same place, making sure they wouldn't get lost again. And then, it happened again. When it was time to present the second set of certificates, they too were gone. I felt like I was losing my mind. I searched everywhere. Every drawer, every shelf. Nothing. Frustrated, I sat down in the office, ready to give up. That's when my eyes drifted toward a mirror leaning against the wall. I noticed something, a small white corner sticking out from behind it. I got up, reached behind the mirror, and pulled it out. It was the original certificates, the ones I had first lost. The second set? Nowhere to be found. Days later, they just appeared, sitting right on a shelf in plain sight, as if someone had put them there on purpose. I don't know what lived in that house with us, but I know one thing for sure, it wasn't just a house. It was something more. Something that watched. Something that listened. And something that, every now and then, wanted to make its presence known. My mom and stepdad had only been married for a year, but we had known him for a long time, since I was 5 years old. When he first moved to our town with his ex-wife and son, they bought an old house in a remote part of town. It was one of the oldest homes in the area, built in the 1700s by a sea captain and passed down through generations for nearly 200 years before it was eventually abandoned. By the time my stepdad bought it, the house had been sitting empty for years, its condition deteriorating. But with extensive renovations, it looked as good as new. The house was L-shaped, with the main two-story structure being the original build and an additional one-floor section added in the 1800s, which contained the living room, kitchen, a back office, and a bathroom. When I first visited, my stepdad gave us a tour, showing off the modern renovations. The back of the house felt warm and inviting, with its polished wooden floors and a large fireplace. But the moment we stepped into the older part of the house, something felt different. I couldn't explain why, but unease settled deep within me. It wasn't the dim lighting or the old wooden structure itself. Something about the space just felt wrong. The anxiety heightened as we moved upstairs. The narrow staircase with its low ceiling made me feel trapped, and the long hallway felt like it stretched on forever. Even though the house had plenty of windows, it always seemed unnaturally dark. There was something about that space that made me feel like I was being watched. No matter where I was, I felt like something was standing behind me, waiting. Opening doors felt terrifying, as if something was just on the other side, ready to jump out. The feeling followed me through the house, creeping up on me every time I turned a corner. If I was alone in the front part of the house, I would run to the back, desperate to escape the overwhelming sensation of being chased. Being alone in that part of the house felt like being completely exposed to something unseen. I visited the house often as a child because my stepbrother and I were the same age. Unlike me, he never seemed scared. He would wander into the places I refused to go, completely at ease. Once, we were playing hide and seek. I was too afraid to search upstairs, so I spent extra time looking around the downstairs area, hoping I wouldn't have to go up there. As I stood near the staircase, I heard a faint rustling from the closet underneath it. Relieved that I had found him, I swung the door open and shouted, but the closet was empty. There were only a couple of jackets hanging inside. My heart pounded. I knew I had heard something. Too afraid to go upstairs alone, I asked my stepdad to help me find my stepbrother. As we climbed the stairs, we both heard a noise in the upstairs hallway. It sounded like someone had bumped into the wall. I rushed ahead, expecting to see him, but instead, I found an old rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of someone humming. There was no one there. There was no open window, no draft that could have moved the chair. My entire body tensed. A chill ran through me as I felt something standing right next to me, its breath brushing against my skin. I panicked. My arms flailed as I tried to swat away something I couldn't see. I screamed and ran downstairs, straight into my stepbrother, who had been hiding under the sofa the entire time. That was the last time I ever went upstairs alone. A year later, my mother insisted that I sleep over to bond with my stepbrother. The idea of staying overnight terrified me, especially because his bedroom was upstairs. I begged them to let me sleep on the couch in the back living room, but they refused. They wanted me upstairs, where all the bedrooms were. I argued, protested, but eventually I gave in. That night, as I was being put to bed, I watched my stepdad's ex-wife shut the door to the upstairs bedroom and turn off the light. I fell asleep faster than I expected, but I woke up in complete darkness. Not the kind of darkness that allows your eyes to adjust. This was absolute blackness. A suffocating, heavy void. And then I heard it. Slow, deep breathing. The sound was steady, rhythmic, close. I turned to check my stepbrother's bed, but he wasn't there. I tensed. From the hallway, I heard footsteps. I assumed he had gotten up to use the bathroom, but he never came back. Time dragged on, and the breathing in the room continued. I hid under the blanket, hoping that if I stayed still, whatever was there wouldn't notice me. The fear became unbearable. I threw the blanket off, jumped out of bed, and bolted for the stairs. The moment my feet hit the first step, I heard it behind me. Heavy, pounding footsteps. Something was chasing me. The sound was right on my heels, each step echoing through the stairwell. I felt its presence looming behind me, closing in. I ran as fast as I could, down the hallway, toward the back of the house, ready to throw myself into the living room where I would be safe. But I ran straight into the dining room door. It had never been closed before. The impact was so loud that it woke my stepdad. He turned on all the lights and ran to me, asking what had happened. I couldn't even form the words. My whole body was shaking. I kept saying that something had been chasing me, that there was someone else in the house. Thinking I meant an intruder, he searched every room, every corner, but found nothing. Still, seeing how terrified I was, he let me sleep on the downstairs sofa for the rest of the night. As I got older, I stopped fearing the house, but I still refused to be alone upstairs. The feeling of being watched never left me. Even when I wasn't directly experiencing anything, I always felt like something was there, waiting. Sometimes, I would hear things, music playing from an unknown source, voices calling my name, footsteps when no one else was home. Objects would move, small things would disappear and reappear in places they shouldn't have been. No one ever believed me. They told me I was imagining it. Years later, after my stepdad and his ex-wife had moved out, I visited the house again when it was put up for sale. The new owners had remodeled it, replacing the dark walls with bright white paint, making the windows larger to let in more light. It felt different. The atmosphere wasn't as heavy, but I could still feel something lingering. While walking through the upstairs hallway, I separated from the group, stood in the center of the hall, and said aloud, "If there is anyone here, reveal yourselves to me." I expected nothing. But just as I finished speaking, I felt a soft breeze against my face. A curtain at the end of the hallway shifted slightly, and then it was gone. It felt like a response. A final acknowledgement. After a recent conversation with my stepbrother, he admitted that he had always felt the same things I did. He had just pretended not to be scared. Eventually, he moved his bedroom to the downstairs office because he could no longer stand sleeping upstairs. His mother did the same. They never admitted it at the time because they didn't want to scare me, but now that we were older, they confirmed everything. There was a legend about the house. Over a century ago, a woman had been murdered there. Her husband had pushed her down the stairs in the middle of an argument. Whether it was her presence I felt or something else entirely, I'll never know. But I do know one thing, the house was never empty. Something always remained, watching, waiting. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. My mom worked as a school librarian for 23 years in a small public school that had been built sometime in the 1950s or 60s. The school had a basic H-shaped layout, with a few modular classrooms outside. The administration office, teacher's lounge, gym, and cafeteria were all near the front entrance in the center of the H. My mom's library was on the lower right leg of the building, toward the southeast. At the ends of each hallway were self-locking fire doors that could be used but couldn't be propped open without setting off alarms. The year after my mom retired, the entire school was demolished. I don't even know if they built a new one in the same place. Whenever I visited, I always entered through the front doors and checked in at the office. I had only been to the cafeteria once and had never really explored beyond the hallway leading to my mom's library. A few times, I'd stepped into classrooms in that wing or the teacher's lounge during the day, but that was the extent of my familiarity with the building. My mom's library was small but filled with life. It had a massive, reading dragon, and a life-size statue of a beloved fictional character. My mom adored that statue. She dressed it up for holidays, talked to it like an old friend, and the younger kids loved it. I, however, always found it a little unsettling. Maybe it was the way its eyes seemed to follow you or how it stood perfectly still in the corner of the library, watching. I tried not to dwell on it. I'd only been there a handful of times during school hours. Once, I went to see my sister-in-law dressed up as Clifford the Big Red Dog for a book fair. Happy thoughts, happy thoughts. Despite all that, I never liked the building. It always smelled like mildew, dust, and the sweat of 1,000 sticky elementary school hands. Some schools just had that weird old feeling, a used-up energy that lingered in the air. I had been in plenty of creepy old schools before, many larger and older than this one. So I shrugged off my discomfort. It was just another rundown school, nothing special. That changed when I visited to help my mom clean out her library before her retirement. She had trouble letting things go, and I had flown in from the West Coast to help her meet her deadline. I understood her struggle, Working in used bookstores had made me familiar with the pain of discarding books. But we had to be ruthless. We boxed up donations, lined the hallways with piles of discarded books, and stacked trash bags wherever we could. The janitor was on vacation, meaning there was no easy way to haul things out to the dumpsters. At one point, I needed trash bags and knew the custodian's supply room was just inside the boys' bathroom entrance. I had never gone in there before. The bathrooms had no doors, just open entrances, and were located near the main hall, across from the teacher's lounge. Out of habit, I announced myself before stepping inside, just in case. At first, nothing seemed unusual, aside from the typical childhood discomfort of being in the wrong restroom. But by the second or third trip, the feeling in there shifted. Something was watching me. I don't mean the usual unsettling sensation of being in a dark, abandoned building. This was a physical, almost crushing presence, pressing against me like something was waiting, lurking. The air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. The feeling intensified with every trip. By the last time, I just grabbed as many bags as I could carry and got the hell out of there. That was on the first day. I chalked it up to nerves and feeling weird about the space, but deep down, I knew it was something else. That evening, my mom and I worked until around 7, well before dark. She had casually mentioned she liked to be out of the building by 9. I assumed it was a school district policy. The next day, we barely had time to finish. It was a Friday, and after 3 or 4 p.m., we were the only 2 people in the entire school. My patience was already running thin when I discovered that, on top of clearing out the library, my mom had also stored 20 years' worth of book fair decorations and supplies in 2 large storage rooms across from the bathrooms. The same area where I had felt that oppressive presence the day before. She focused on sorting her remaining books, leaving me alone to clean out the storage spaces. The feeling of being watched returned instantly, stronger than before. It felt like something was creeping down the hall toward me, seeping from the bathrooms. The tiny storage spaces felt like traps, suffocatingly small. I felt cornered. It took all my willpower not to drop everything and run straight back to my mom. Instead, I shoveled everything into trash bags as fast as I could. I didn't care what was in there anymore. I just needed to be done. By the time we finished, it was dark. Only the emergency lights illuminated the hallways, but my mom had turned on the overhead lights near us. The sense of being watched hadn't faded, it had grown worse. Even with her there, I felt like we were being pinned in by something just outside our line of sight. Mom locked us in without a word. She didn't acknowledge what we were both feeling, but I could tell she was uneasy too. Still, we pushed through the last bit of work. When she finally said we should go home, I checked my watch. It was only 8 p.m. We still had an hour. I told her we should finish everything now so we wouldn't have to return. She hesitated but agreed. We worked in silence. The only sounds were the rustling of paper, the shuffle of books, and our breathing. The feeling of something hovering near us never went away. When we were finally done, I grabbed my things and walked toward the fire exit at the end of the hall. Mom stayed behind, locking the library door. That was when the fear truly set in. She had to drop her keys off in the office before leaving, meaning I had to wait in the dim hallway for her return. I stood there, gripping my things, staring straight ahead, willing myself not to look behind me. I could feel it. Something lurking in the dark, the shadows stretching unnaturally from the other hallways. It felt hungry, like it had been waiting for this moment. The hallway was short, but the seconds dragged into eternity. Finally, my mom returned, walking toward me, moving slow. I forced myself to stay still, to not scream, to not acknowledge the suffocating dread crawling up my spine. The second she reached me, I bolted for the exit. We stepped out, checked the door, and crammed into the car. I shook it off. It was just the dark, just my imagination. Right. The next morning, we returned for the last of her belongings. The school was now filled with staff preparing for the new year. One of the teachers waved and sent his teenage son to open the fire exit for us. The boy walked alongside me, helping carry a few boxes. Then, completely casual, he asked, "So, you were here late last night, did you hear ghosts?" I tried to play it cool, forcing a laugh. "No, why?" He shrugged. "People hear things here all the time. Kids laughing, footsteps, voices. My dad won't stay after dark anymore. One night, he and another teacher chased some voices and slamming doors, but no one was there." My stomach dropped. I could feel the blood drain from my face. He noticed. "Yeah, it scares my dad too," he added, as if that would comfort me. When we got in the car, I told my mom everything. That I had been terrified in the bathroom, the storage rooms, the hallway, the night before. She didn't even blink. "The staff have all heard and seen things for years," she said. "Especially in the tunnels." Tunnels? Apparently, a series of underground tunnels ran from the boys' bathroom to the other side of the gym. She never mentioned that before. And she never stayed after 9 because she knew she couldn't fight whatever it was. She had worked there for 23 years. I sat in the sunlight, safe in the car, and just started crying. My ex-husband's grandmother, uncle, and aunt had purchased an old home inside the city limits after the state bought their land in the 1950s to build an interstate and a rest area. With the money they received, they relocated, hoping to start fresh. But whatever hope they had quickly turned into tragedy. The house had a dark history, one that I didn't fully understand at first. Eileen, the aunt, had been attacked and assaulted by 3 men in the alleyway behind the house one evening. The trauma broke her. She was committed to a local asylum, where she ultimately took her own life. Not long after, the grandmother suffered a terrible fall down the front steps, requiring full-time nursing care. She was admitted into a facility, and shortly after arriving, she passed away. The only one left was the uncle. He was already mentally unstable, and the weight of everything that had happened was too much for him. He attempted to take his own life in that house by slashing his wrists. He survived but was also committed to a facility for his safety. For years, the house sat abandoned, sealed shut, collecting dust along with its ghosts. My ex-husband and I saw an opportunity. We convinced the uncle to let us live there, offering to take care of the place. He seemed almost relieved, even excited, that someone wanted to bring life back into the home. I had always been sensitive to the paranormal, but that didn't deter me. I was about to have a baby and wanted my own space. I believed that bringing in young energy and a new child might breathe life back into the house. So, we made plans to move in. My ex-husband worked the night shift at a local restaurant, which meant I had plenty of time alone to clean and repaint before we officially moved in. The first and only night I went there alone to paint, I felt a deep unease as soon as I pulled up. The house did not feel welcoming. Still, I forced myself to push through, gathering my supplies and heading inside. Once inside, the feeling worsened. Something about the air, the stillness, the way the shadows clung to the corners, it was unsettling. But I had always been the type to finish what I started, no matter how uncomfortable I felt. I took deep breaths, pushed aside my fear, and began painting. It didn't take long before I knew I wasn't alone. At first, it was just strange noises, faint shifting sounds in different parts of the house. I ignored them and kept working. Then, the noises turned into whispers and a strange hissing sound. My stomach tightened, but I still refused to leave. The bathroom was just on the other side of the wall where I was painting. It still had one of those metal chairs inside the shower, the kind used by people who couldn't stand. As I worked, I heard movement in the bathroom. Something shifted, followed by the abrupt sound of the chair scraping across the floor. I froze. Then I heard the bathroom door shut. Another hiss. I didn't turn around. My heart pounded, but I kept my eyes locked on the wall in front of me. I felt it. Something was standing right behind me. The air grew thick, charged with a presence I couldn't see but knew was there. Then, right next to my ear, a whisper. It said my name. Donnell. I dropped the paint roller and ran. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't lock the doors. I left everything behind, the radio still playing, the house abandoned just as I had found it. Most people would have decided right then and there to never set foot in that house again. But I didn't have the luxury of options. The situation at my in-laws was unbearable. I was about to have my first child and needed a home. So, I never told my ex-husband what had happened that night. I simply told him I was too exhausted from pregnancy to finish painting alone, and that we should do it together on his days off. We lived there for 3 years. The activity didn't stop, but it wasn't unbearable. There were voices in the basement, handprints on the ceiling, and a stain in the dining room that refused to go away no matter how hard I scrubbed. One night, while my husband was at work, I was hit by a sudden nesting instinct. I stayed up late, cleaning every inch of the house. As I worked in the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the basement. The sound was distorted, like a radio station caught between frequencies. It continued for several moments before stopping abruptly. I walked to the basement door and locked it. From then on, I kept it locked at all times. I heard those voices often, but I never mentioned them to my husband. One morning, while lying in bed, I noticed handprints on the ceiling above me. They were faint but clearly visible, an odd sight given how high the ceiling was. I didn't think much of it at first, but as time passed, the handprints multiplied. Every time I looked, there were more. The television turned on by itself several times. One night, as we were heading to bed, it happened again. My ex-husband and I just exchanged a glance before he walked over and turned it off. Another time, the volume blared at full blast in the middle of the night. The sound startled me awake, and when I looked up, there were even more handprints on the ceiling. Then there was the stain in the dining room. No matter how many times I cleaned the carpet, it always reappeared. I eventually asked the uncle where he had tried to take his own life. He pointed to the dining room. After realizing the stain wasn't going anywhere, I just covered it with a rug. For over a year, these things continued. Then, the uncle called in the middle of the night, begging me to get him out of the nursing home. We took him in, and the activity stopped immediately. When I became pregnant with our second child, things took a turn. One winter evening, I slipped on the front steps, the same ones where his grandmother had fallen. I had asked my ex-husband several times to keep them ice-free, but he never did. As I fell, I grabbed the railing and twisted my body, trying to protect my unborn baby. I landed hard on my back. I was rushed to the hospital, where doctors monitored me for 24 hours. They said everything was fine, but the remainder of my pregnancy became incredibly difficult. What was supposed to be a natural birth turned into an emergency C-section. When our second child was only 2 months old, the uncle abruptly kicked us out. He took everything from us. We had no choice but to leave the house for good. That should have been the end of it. But when my second child was about 10 months old, I started getting sick. It started small. I couldn't keep food or liquids down. Then it became constant, relentless. I went through numerous ER visits, specialists, endless tests, but no one could figure out what was wrong. 2 years later, they finally found the problem. When I had fallen on those cursed front steps, the force of the impact had crushed my spleen against my pancreas and spine. My spleen died, taking 60% of my pancreas with it. My spine was permanently damaged. I nearly died from a single fall. That one accident stole my health at 22 years old. Since then, my life has been a never-ending cycle of surgeries, pain, and suffering. Looking back, I wish I had never set foot in that house. I should have stayed at my in-laws. At least then, I would have still had my health. I have always dealt with the paranormal. It has been a constant in my life for as long as I can remember. Strange occurrences, eerie sensations, and unexplained disturbances, none of it has ever truly surprised me. I've grown accustomed to it. But in the house we live in now, the one we are in the process of buying, there have been things happening that feel different. This time, it's not just your typical haunting. This time, it worries me. They say that demons and dark entities often use the number 3 to mock the Holy Trinity. That's what makes me think that whatever is in this house may not be a simple lingering spirit but something far more malevolent. In the 2 years we have lived here, I have witnessed a number of disturbances. My dogs have started growling and barking at nothing. They refuse to go into the backyard at night, no matter how badly they need to go out. I have felt my blanket move while lying in bed, and on multiple occasions, my children and I have heard someone knock 3 times on the door, only to find no one there. Normally, when I enter a place, I can immediately sense if there's energy attached to it. But when we first moved into this house, I didn't feel anything. That's why I don't understand why, now, something seems to be here. It makes me question whether it was here all along or if it somehow found its way in. The first incident happened when my son and I were in the kitchen making a snack. He went into the pantry while I stood by the stove, focused on cooking. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone walk up next to me. Assuming it was my son, I turned to speak to him, but as soon as I moved, the shadow darted away and vanished before my eyes. I knew instantly that I had just seen something that was not my son. Since then, I have noticed strange sounds late at night. I'll be sitting with my dogs when I hear bumps and shifting noises coming from the kitchen. The dogs hear it too. Their ears perk up, their heads turn sharply in the direction of the sound, and sometimes they even growl at something invisible. On more than one occasion, I have caught them staring at the backyard through the window, refusing to go outside. I don't know what they see, but whatever it is, they are terrified of it. My husband works nights, leaving me alone most of the time. I have felt the blankets move as if something were tugging at them or sliding across the fabric. More than once, I have felt a light touch against my side, a sensation so faint yet deliberate that it sent chills down my spine. The worst has been the sound of something hitting my bed frame, a solid bang against the iron that makes no sense. Then there are the knocks. More than once, my kids and I have been sitting in the living room late at night when we hear 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the door. It isn't the front door, which would make more sense if it were a prank or a mistake. It's always the door leading to the mudroom, a door that few people even know exists. Each time we check, there is no one there. The first few times I told myself it was just my imagination. But the pattern has become impossible to ignore. 3 knocks. Always 3. Before we put up a fence, my husband had left some of his tools outside near the mudroom. One night, I was sitting in the mudroom with the window open while I smoked. Suddenly, I heard someone rustling through the tools just outside. At first, I thought it was a thief. It didn't make sense, though. Why would someone be bold enough to rummage through tools right outside a lit window when it was obvious someone was home? I coughed, hoping to startle them and make them aware of my presence. The noise stopped immediately. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the rummaging started again. I listened, heart pounding, waiting for them to leave. Finally, I heard footsteps retreating, followed by a faint voice muttering something unintelligible. The next day, I went outside expecting to find some of my husband's tools missing. Not a single thing was gone. Months later, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to buy a spirit box in the hopes of reaching out to my deceased father. I had heard stories of people successfully using them to communicate with loved ones, and I wanted to see if I could do the same. At first, I got a lot of input, but nothing from my dad. The voices coming through seemed fragmented, unclear. Then, something changed. One night, I was sitting in the mudroom, using the spirit box with only a candle for light. As the voices came through, I started hearing warnings, words and phrases that made my stomach tighten. Danger. Then silence. The air in the room grew heavy. I suddenly felt watched, as if something had drawn closer. Then, low growling sounds came through the box. It wasn't static. It wasn't noise interference. It was something growling at me. I shut the box off immediately. Still shaken, I sat there in the dim candlelight, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. That's when I heard scratching, 3 long, deliberate scrapes against the wall just outside my window. I put the spirit box away after that. Months passed before I touched it again. When I finally decided to try once more, I turned the box on and sat in the same spot in the mudroom. At first, it was quiet. Then, a voice came through. Yours. I froze. Then, the same voice spoke again. The door is locked. I glanced toward the back door. It was open, only the screen door was closed and latched. Then, one final phrase came through. Harm you. And then, another growl. I shut the spirit box off and never used it again. Since that night, I got rid of the box entirely. But whatever was in the house didn't leave with it. Every night, when I sit in the mudroom with the door open and only the screen door between me and the outside, I hear it. The stairs creak. Something heavy shifts its weight at the bottom step. Then, I hear the distinct sound of claws hooking into the metal lip of the screen door. Whatever it is, it's still here. And it's waiting. Before I left my last workplace, several colleagues told me something I had never known before, that the building had once been used as a morgue during World War II, between 1942 and 1945. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. The old cottage hospital had once been just up the road. The church across the street still stood, and the bishop's residence had remained intact. Even the funeral home was only a block away. The building itself had been through many changes. The ground floor, built with original sandstone, had stood for much longer than the second floor, which was added later. After the war, it became a sports and recreation club before eventually sitting abandoned for years. Then, a few years ago, it was repurposed as office space. I wonder now if the renovations and movement of people into the building stirred something that should have remained undisturbed. One of the supervisors who came in early reported hearing strange noises in the mornings. She would hear movement downstairs, shuffling footsteps, the sound of something shifting, as if people were walking around in an otherwise empty space. She was sensitive to the paranormal and had encountered strange things before, so when she said she felt something there, I believed her. Another coworker confessed that she hated going downstairs. She couldn't explain why, but every time she stepped into the meeting room, an overwhelming fear would take over. She avoided using that space and wouldn't stay there alone. That meeting room, the one supposedly built where the old morgue had been, was always cold, even in the middle of summer, even when the room was packed with people. Upstairs, the women's restroom had the same problem. No matter how warm the rest of the building was, those two spaces remained unnaturally cold. I had always brushed it off as poor insulation, but now I wasn't so sure. As time went on, the entire office began to feel tense and uneasy. People became irritable, short-tempered, and quick to argue over the smallest things. There was no reason for the tension, yet it lingered like a thick, unseen presence in the air. By the time I left each day, I felt drained, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. It was as if something was stirring up the worst in everyone, pulling at their energy, feeding off their emotions. Some days, walking past my coworkers felt like pushing through cobwebs, like wading through thick mud. The weight of it all only lifted when certain people were absent. The air felt lighter on those days, and everything seemed clearer. But when everyone was there, the oppression was unbearable. It became too much. The stress was affecting my health. The building was poisoning my mind in a way I couldn't fully understand. Eventually, I knew I had to leave. During my last week, I decided to take a few photos of the place as a keepsake. Before heading downstairs, I whispered a prayer of protection and asked for blessings. It seemed like the smart thing to do. At first, my phone camera worked fine. But then, suddenly, the button stopped responding. I tapped at it, confused, but for a long moment, it wouldn't take a picture. When it finally worked again, the autofocus malfunctioned, and every picture turned out blurry. My hands were steady, yet the images looked like I had been shaking. Some photos came out brighter than expected, even though the room itself had seemed dark to my eyes. Strangest of all, my phone's flash never turned on, even though it was supposed to activate in low-light settings. Then, from the lounge area, I heard something fall over. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. The air felt charged, full of unseen eyes. A crowd of people, their curious gazes locked on me. I had the strangest feeling that they had never seen a mobile phone before. Without thinking, I spoke aloud. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted some photos for the memories. I wish you all peace." I had no idea who I was talking to. No idea why I said what I did. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I turned and left in a hurry. When I later showed the pictures to friends who had experience with the paranormal, a few of them noticed something unusual. Faint shadows where there should have been none. One friend, who came from a family with unusual abilities, examined a photo of the staircase. He pointed to a faint figure sitting on the bottom step, his head bowed, smoking a cigarette. Another photo showed several shadowy figures gathered in the lounge area, standing near the windows. The noise I had heard, the thing that fell? A friend suggested that some files had been knocked off a chair nearby. The idea of the morgue being connected to World War II never sat right with me. Instead, I started to think that maybe the story originated from the 1918 influenza pandemic. The virus had overwhelmed the small hospital up the road, leaving them no choice but to use other buildings as temporary morgues. The ground floor of this building could have been one of them. Bodies could have been stored there before being ferried across town to the quarantine station. Later, during World War II, the building might have served as a hospice for wounded soldiers, a place where the mortally wounded were given comfort in their final days. A small bronze plaque near the entrance confirmed part of this theory. It read, "The Soldier's Wing." Whatever the real history was, I was just relieved to be done with that place. I didn't mind the lingering memories. I didn't even mind the possibility of ghosts. It was the living people, the dark energy twisting through them, the way the building turned them against each other, that was what truly haunted me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. 10 years ago, we moved into our current house. Over the years, my children, my wife, and even our dogs have all had strange experiences. At first, we brushed them off, telling ourselves it was just the house settling in. But as time went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. It started subtly, doors opening and closing on their own, voices whispering from empty rooms, shadows darting down the hallways and staircase. The creaks and noises that we first dismissed as normal soon began happening at odd times, in patterns that suggested something more than just an aging house. One of the most unsettling things has been the motion sensor light in the upstairs bathroom. The bathroom is located just off the bedrooms, with a staircase leading down to the main living room. Many times, while sitting on the couch, I would hear footsteps coming down the stairs. One night, this happened while I was sitting with my 2 dogs. The bathroom light suddenly turned on, the stairs creaked, and my dogs snapped to attention, tracking something I couldn't see as it moved slowly across the living room. Their heads followed it, eyes locked on something invisible. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys and left the house. Another time, I was watching TV in the family room while my youngest daughter, Savannah, ran around playing with a toy laser pointer. I told her to stop, irritated by the flashing light. A few minutes later, I noticed a soft glow coming from the dining room, slowly making its way down the hallway. Assuming it was Savannah playing with the laser again, I leaned forward in my chair to scold her. But it wasn't her. Instead of my daughter, I saw an orb, a floating sphere of light, the size of a globe. And inside it, a man's face. I froze. The orb moved slowly, deliberately, about 8 feet off the ground. The man inside had Roman-style hair and a beard, his features ancient yet familiar, his face framed by a golden tassel around his collar. The glow around him was like a bright blue sky, swirling, shifting inside the orb. He was coming down the hallway straight toward me. I leaned back into my chair, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind struggled to make sense of it. The orb passed through the hallway, breached the family room, and for a moment, it didn't seem to notice me. Then, as if suddenly aware of my presence, it turned to face me. I wasn't scared. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. Instead, I just stared at it. Then, in an instant, the overhead fluorescent lights in the room flickered on. The whole room lit up immediately, snapping me out of my trance. I instinctively turned toward the light switch, expecting to see someone standing there. There was no one. It had happened in a split second. The lights had turned on by themselves. As I turned my gaze back toward the orb, it was gone. I stood up, my heart hammering, and noticed something else. The motion floodlights outside the back doors were also on. They had been triggered, as if something had moved through the backyard. I suddenly realized what had happened. It had created a diversion. The orb had turned the lights on to distract me while it left through the glass doors, setting off the motion lights as it vanished outside. I bolted upstairs to my bedroom and sat on my bed, staring at the door. I didn't sleep that night. Days later, after I had finally calmed down, I replayed the event in my mind. The orb. The man's face inside it. The lights. The motion sensors. The way it had seemed intelligent, like it knew I had seen it, and had chosen to leave at that exact moment. It wasn't until then that I started thinking about the history of the house. When we first looked at this house, it wasn't even on the market. We had been touring another house nearby when the real estate agent got a call about a new divorce sale listing. Since it was just around the corner, the agent suggested we check it out. The moment we arrived, something felt off. Every door in the house had a deadbolt lock, including the front door. You needed a key to get in and out of most rooms. The house wasn't just divided physically, it had been split in every way possible. The wife had been living upstairs, in the bedroom facing the driveway. The husband had been living in the back of the house. They had gone so far as to build an actual wall inside the house, creating separate entrances, separate kitchens, separate bathrooms. They refused to share space. It was like something straight out of the War of the Roses. When we moved in, we knocked down the wall and restored the house to its original layout. But even after opening it back up, the feeling of division remained. Now, 10 years later, my wife and I are separated, living in the exact same conditions as the previous owners. She lives upstairs in the room facing the driveway. I live in the back of the house. The only difference is that the wall isn't there anymore. Coincidence? I don't think so. The more I think about it, the more I believe it's the house. Maybe the house absorbs the conflict, feeding off it, trapping people in the same patterns. Maybe the previous owners fought, built their own separate spaces, and eventually tore each other apart. And now, somehow, we've fallen into the same cycle. I don't know if the orb was connected to the house's history or something else entirely, but I do know one thing. Whatever exists in this house doesn't want peace. In 2005, we found a charming older house in the historic part of downtown Pocatello, Idaho. It immediately caught my attention. Something about it just felt different, like stepping into a time capsule. The house still had its original carpeting, wallpaper, and even the old stove from the 1940s or 1950s. I loved that nostalgic feel, even though the stove ended up being more of an inconvenience than a treasure. It was so small that baking was a nightmare. But everything else about the house had this untouched, preserved energy, like the past was still lingering in the air. As I walked through each room, I started noticing little details that made the house feel almost like a personal museum. Inside the closets of the bedrooms, someone had taped album inserts of Perry Como to the doors. It was something you'd expect a teenage girl from the 1950s to do, decorating her space with pictures of a singer she adored. The album itself was one of his earliest releases. That struck me as odd, because everything about the house felt like it had been frozen in that era, like no one had changed a thing for decades. Curious about the home's history, I asked the realtor about it. She explained that an elderly woman had lived there since the 1940s, raising her daughter in the house. She had passed away just a year before it was listed for rent. That made everything make sense. The Perry Como album, the outdated decor, the feeling of stepping into someone else's carefully preserved world. It wasn't just an old house. It was her house. Something about that idea fascinated me, and instead of feeling creeped out, I felt drawn to it. This place wasn't just another rental, it had history, and that made it feel special. I decided to take the Perry Como room as my own, leaving the album insert exactly where it was, almost as if I was paying respect to whoever had once lived there. That decision might have been a mistake. The problem started immediately. From the moment we moved in, the house seemed to fight back against us. The bathroom flooded. The kitchen flooded. The toilet stopped working completely. Every time we fixed one issue, another one would appear out of nowhere. It was endless. Plumbers came and went, repairs were made, but the house refused to stay fixed. Even the stove, which had survived decades of use, suddenly stopped working. It felt personal, like the house was rejecting us, like we weren't supposed to be there. One of the first nights, I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep with the television buzzing softly in the background. Just as I started nodding off, I was jolted awake by a loud, heavy slam at the foot of my bed. My heart stopped. I sat up, scanning the room, but there was nothing there, nothing that could have made that noise. But I felt something. I couldn't explain it, but it was like someone was angry that I had fallen asleep with the TV on. The message was clear: turn it off. After that night, I always made sure to turn off the television before falling asleep. Between my bedroom and my kids' rooms, there was a small hallway, and I had placed a lamp on a small table there to give them a little light at night in case they needed to get up. More than once, I heard movement outside my door late at night. Thinking it was one of my boys getting up to use the bathroom, I would watch the door, waiting for them to come ask me to tuck them back in. But they never did. The door had a small gap at the bottom, and an old skeleton keyhole that allowed just enough visibility to see the hallway. I could see shadows moving. Someone was walking back and forth, but it wasn't my children. Every time I got up to check on them, I found both of them sound asleep in their beds. The movement in the hallway never stopped, but there was never anyone there when I looked. I started to realize that I was not alone in this house, not even when it was just me and my kids. The worst place of all was the basement. I had tried to make a small painting nook down there, hoping for a quiet space to work. The first few times, I tried to ignore it, but it became impossible. I was never alone down there. The air was thick, heavy, like something was standing right behind me, watching me paint. The feeling grew stronger every time I went downstairs until I couldn't take it anymore. Eventually, I stopped going down there altogether. It wasn't worth the dread. As if the strange occurrences weren't enough, I started feeling sick all the time. At first, I thought it was just stress or maybe a cold that wouldn't go away. But the pattern became obvious. The moment I left the house, I felt fine. As soon as I stepped back inside, I felt sick again. It was like the house itself was draining me, suffocating me in slow motion. At the same time, my ex-husband and I started fighting constantly. We had never fought like this before, but now it was every day, over nothing. We were both angry all the time, snapping at each other for the smallest things. It was like something in the house was pushing us against each other, feeding off our frustration, making everything worse. By this point, I had stopped sleeping properly. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me, that something was waiting just out of sight. The basement was off limits, the hallway was a nightmare, and I couldn't even lie in bed without feeling like I was being judged by some unseen force. I started thinking about the elderly woman who had lived here her whole life. This house had been hers, and she had raised her daughter here. She had died only a year before we moved in. I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she never actually left. Maybe she didn't want us here. Maybe she didn't want anyone here. We only lasted 3 months in that house. That was all I could take. The constant malfunctions, the strange noises, the shadows, the sickness, the fights, it became unbearable. Looking back, I believe that the elderly woman wasn't ready to let go of her home. She had spent a lifetime in that house, and she wasn't about to welcome outsiders, no matter how much time had passed. She had been set in her ways, and she wasn't going to let anyone change that. It all started when I was 10 years old. my family and I moved from Indiana to be closer to my mother's side of the family. We found a house just half a block away from them, and at first, everything seemed normal. But from the very beginning, I had a strange feeling about that house, something only I seemed to pick up on. It was a one-story, 4-bedroom, 2-bath home, nothing remarkable about it on the surface. But every time I walked from my room to the kitchen, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, as if my instincts were screaming at me to run, like something was right behind me. It wasn't just unease, it was pure fear, a primal feeling that made no sense. The worst part was the hall bathroom. Every time I stepped inside, nausea would creep over me, like my body was rejecting something in that space. At first, we tried to rationalize things. We started hearing noises throughout the house, small but noticeable sounds that we assumed were coming from rodents or some kind of pest. My father called an exterminator, expecting a simple explanation, but the man found nothing. No droppings, no nests, not even a possible entry point for animals. There was no logical reason for the sounds we were hearing. But they didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Soon, objects started disappearing. Small things, keys, toys, hairbrushes, would go missing, only to turn up later in the strangest place, the cabinet under the sink in the hall bathroom. It didn't matter where they had been lost, that was where they would always reappear. My parents were convinced my sister and I were playing tricks on them, but we weren't. The more they blamed us, the more their own behavior started to change. They were both loving, caring parents, but now they seemed to snap at each other over the smallest things. The house had a way of making everyone tense, angry, on edge. My little sister was the first to hear the growling. It came from her bedroom late at night, a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She also heard footsteps pacing back and forth when no one was there. Meanwhile, I began experiencing something equally unsettling. It started as a slow, steady knocking on my bedroom window at night. Not frantic, not random, just a steady, deliberate knock, like someone asking to be let in. I thought it was a prank, maybe other kids from the neighborhood messing with me, so I ignored it. One night, I was in a bad mood, irritated by something I can't even remember now. I decided I had had enough of the knocking. I threw back the curtains, expecting to catch someone in the act. But there was no one there. It only took 2 seconds to move from my bed to the window. There was no way someone could have run away that fast. The realization sent a cold wave of fear through me. It wasn't a prank. Someone, or something, had been knocking on my window all along. When I told my parents, they dismissed it immediately. They said I was letting my imagination get the best of me, that I was just hearing things. But after that night, things escalated. My sister would wake up screaming, convinced a shadow was chasing her. My parents told her they were just bad dreams, but she has those same nightmares to this day. By the time I was 16, my parents had divorced, and I had been living in that house for 6 years. The knocking had stopped for a while, but that night, as I was lifting barbells in my room, I heard it again. The same steady rhythm, the same eerie patience. I turned to the window, yanked the curtains open, and once again, nothing. My sister was 11 by then, and she still had the nightmares. But now, things were worse. Both of us were waking up with scratches on our bodies. Not just once or twice, night after night. If it had been occasional, maybe we could have ignored it, but it happened so often that we couldn't pretend anymore. Then, we started noticing something else. We weren't just getting scratched. We were also waking up with what looked like bite marks. Not small ones, not insect bites. These were the size of human canines, 2 deep punctures, always in pairs. I started asking questions about the house, trying to find out if something had happened there before we moved in. Eventually, I got in contact with the granddaughter of the family who had owned the house before us. She told me they had never experienced anything paranormal while living there. But then, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. When her aunt was 16, she had taken her own life in the hall bathroom. She had mixed rat poison with juice and drank it. That was the same bathroom where all the missing objects had been appearing, the same place where I had always felt sick whenever I walked inside. At that point, I knew we had to do something. I talked to a friend who was interested in the paranormal, and he told me to burn sage and let the smoke fill every corner of the house. I followed his instructions exactly, covering every room, every hallway, making sure no space was left untouched. And for 2 months, everything stopped. No scratches, no knocking, no nightmares. But then, it came back. And this time, it was worse. My sister started seeing the shadow from her nightmares in real life. It was no longer just in her dreams, it was in the house, standing in the corners of rooms, watching. And I saw it too. It wasn't a vague shape or a blur in the dark. It was tall, solid, unmistakable. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like the silhouette of an old cowboy, wide-brimmed hat, long trench coat, standing motionless, observing. The only detail that stood out were its eyes, 2 glowing red orbs staring back at us. I have since grown up, married, and moved out. But my mother and sister still live in that house, and they still see it. No matter what we have done, it has never left. It's still there, waiting, watching, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I don't know what it wants, and I don't know how to get rid of it. But I fear that as long as my family stays in that house, they will never truly be free of it. I have always been fascinated by the supernatural, reading stories and occasionally watching TV programs about encounters. Despite my curiosity, I had never experienced anything myself. An ex-girlfriend of mine, who was from Japan and claimed to have a connection with spirits, once told me that I had a black aura around me, something she believed acted as a ghost repellent. In her opinion, I was the kind of person spirits would avoid entirely. She had told me countless ghost stories of her own, and while I always assumed she was a little crazy, I never necessarily thought she was wrong about the paranormal. Years later, long after we had broken up, I had an experience that made me rethink everything. My previous job involved a lot of travel across Southeast Asia. Every week, I was in a different country, 1 week in Thailand, the next in Japan, then Singapore, and so on. This constant movement meant that I spent hundreds of nights in various hotels, never staying anywhere long enough to feel at home. To me, a hotel was just a place to sleep, or more often, a place to stay up late answering emails to my company in the States. I later learned that hotels are prime locations for spirits. At the time, I thought nothing of it. One particular week, I was in Vung Tau, Vietnam, a coastal town where I had been attending business meetings. It had been an entirely uneventful trip, and I was ready to check out and head to Saigon for my flight home. Checkout was at noon, so I packed my bags in advance, planning to grab them after lunch before leaving. After eating at a local restaurant with colleagues, I returned to the hotel to retrieve my things. The process was routine. I took the elevator up to my floor, stepped out, turned right, then right again, and walked down the long, empty hallway toward my room, 816, which was at the very end on the left. As I walked, I noticed something important. There was no one in the hallway. If anyone had entered or exited my room in that short time, I would have seen them. But there was no one. Reaching my door, I slid in my electronic keycard, heard the lock click open, and pushed the door inward. The moment I did, I heard the toilet flushing. It wasn't just a regular flush, it was loud, almost violent, as if too much water was rushing through the pipes. The bathroom was right next to the entrance, so I was standing just inches from the door when I heard it. My first thought was a maid must have come in early to clean the room before my checkout. It was unusual, but not impossible. I hesitated for a second, then called out, "Hello?" No answer. In 2 steps, I was at the bathroom door. I had assumed I would see a maid standing there, maybe embarrassed that she had entered before I had officially checked out. But as I reached the entrance and looked inside, 2 things hit me at once. The first was what I saw. The toilet was still sloshing with water, but not in any normal way. The amount of water was 3 times what a normal flush would release. It was pouring, swirling violently, as if someone had held the flush down for far too long. The second was what I smelled. A nauseating, rotting stench filled the bathroom, so overpowering that it made my stomach turn. It wasn't sewage, nor was it mold. It was something unnatural, something that didn't belong. And then, just as my eyes locked onto the churning toilet water, the sound stopped. The toilet, which had been flushing so violently just seconds before, immediately went silent. The moment I looked inside, the water stopped moving, the swirling slowed, and then all at once, it was still. The only thing left was the horrid smell hanging in the air, and the unsettling silence of the empty bathroom. A cold tingling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. Something in my instincts told me, get out. I took 2 steps back, moving away from the bathroom door without turning my back on it. My suitcase was already packed and sitting near the door. Without thinking, I grabbed it blindly, my eyes still locked on the now silent, but somehow still menacing bathroom. I didn't stick around to investigate. I fumbled for the door handle, yanked the door open, and left the room as quickly as possible, pulling my suitcase behind me. When I reached the lobby, I went straight to the front desk. I had already checked out online, but something in me needed to ask. Has anyone ever said anything about room 816 being haunted? The receptionist, a young Vietnamese woman, had been smiling politely at me just moments before. But the moment I asked, her expression changed entirely. Her eyes went wide, her lips pressed into a tight line, and she glanced at her colleague behind the desk. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell me no. She didn't ask why. Instead, she simply nodded. That was all the confirmation I needed. My coworkers, of course, thought the whole thing was hilarious. During the 2-hour drive to Saigon, they mocked me, cracking jokes about ghost toilets and phantom plumbers. But I knew what I had seen, what I had smelled, what I had felt. My logical mind tried to explain it away. Maybe the toilet valve had been stuck open. Maybe I had flushed it before leaving for lunch and forgotten about it. But then, how do you explain the sheer amount of water, the instant silence the moment I looked inside, and, most of all, the smell? There was no rational explanation. I have gone over it in my mind countless times, and I still can't make sense of it. I travel to Vietnam frequently for business, and the staff at that hotel now knows me well. Every time I check in, they already know one thing. They never offer me the key to room 816. I won't go inside that room again. Nothing will make me. When we first moved in, the strange occurrences were subtle, small things, barely noticeable at first. Items would go missing, only to reappear in completely different places. Doors would be left slightly open when we knew we had shut them. It was easy to dismiss, easy to tell ourselves it was just forgetfulness or absent-mindedness. But as time passed, it became clear that something else was at work in that house. The real turning point was my jewelry box. I kept all my necklaces neatly hung inside, but time and time again, I would open the box to find them tangled together in impossible knots. At first, I thought maybe I had just been careless, maybe I had bumped the box or something had shifted. But after untangling them, sometimes spending over an hour delicately unraveling the chains, I would put everything back in perfect order, only to find them knotted again the next time I opened the box. It wasn't just a mess. The knots felt deliberate, as if someone had taken the time to weave them together in an intricate, frustrating puzzle. The more it happened, the more it unnerved me. I told Mr. C about it, but he brushed it off at first. He didn't see the same things I did. He didn't feel the weight of something unseen watching us, didn't notice the cold spots that would suddenly appear in certain rooms. He didn't believe in ghosts, and for a long time, that was the end of the discussion. Until one day, I had had enough. I took my entire jewelry box out and showed him. He knew I had untangled the necklaces just weeks ago, so when I opened it, and he saw them all tied together again, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He started pulling the chains out, examining them closely, trying to find some logical reason for why they had gotten that way. But there was none. He spent over an hour unraveling them, struggling with some of the knots. One chain was so tangled it snapped in half. For the first time, he looked at me, his face uneasy. He couldn't explain it. Something wanted our attention. The next sign came in my trinket box, where I kept a collection of lapel pins. One day, I went to grab one and saw that every single pin had been unfastened, all of them sticking straight up, sharp and waiting. I always close the pins so I won't accidentally stab myself, so I was completely confused. Carefully, I closed each one, making sure everything was secure. A few days later, I checked again. The pins were open again, all sticking straight up. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If I had reached in carelessly, I could have injured myself. Badly. I sat down on the bed, overwhelmed. Something was messing with me, something was playing games, but this wasn't just mischief anymore. This was intentional. That's when I finally snapped. I yelled into the empty room. "Who's here?" Silence. But the air changed. It was subtle at first, but within moments, I felt it. A weight pressing down, a heavy, suffocating feeling that settled over me like a thick fog. It was as if something had acknowledged my question but had no intention of answering. After that, things spiraled. Mr. C and I began fighting constantly. We had always been solid, had never had major problems before, but suddenly, everything turned into an argument. The energy in the house felt oppressive, like it was feeding off our frustration and anger. Every day, it became harder to stay there. I started feeling sick, drained, depressed. I didn't feel like myself anymore, and neither did he. Deep down, I knew we had to leave. We finally found another place, and I can't describe the relief I felt knowing we were getting out. I had this idea that once we left, everything would go back to normal, that whatever was in that house wouldn't follow. I was wrong. While packing, I carefully marked our moving boxes, labeling them for each room. But when we unpacked in our new home, nothing was where it should have been. Some boxes were half empty, their contents missing. Others contained things that weren't supposed to be in them. It was like someone, or something, had messed with our belongings while they were in transit. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I had packed in a hurry, maybe I had been distracted. But then, a few weeks later, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was kneeling at the bathtub, scrubbing it clean, when suddenly I felt a sharp, stinging pain just above my ankle. It was so sudden and intense that I jerked back immediately, dropping the sponge. When I looked down, I saw 3 fresh scratches, burning and itching as if something had just clawed at me. A wave of dread washed over me. I had felt completely alone in that bathroom, but in that moment I knew I wasn't. Later that night, I caught a glimpse of my reflection and felt my stomach drop. 2 more scratches had appeared on my neck. Whatever had been in that house had followed me. That was when I knew I needed help. One of my closest friends had just returned from Afghanistan. While she was overseas, she had met someone who was involved in paranormal investigations. Desperate for answers, I called her and asked if she could help. The investigation that followed was terrifying, more than I had ever expected. I still don't know exactly what is attached to me or why it won't leave. I have tried praying, smudging, everything I can think of, but it only ever stops for a short while before starting again. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of it. I just keep trying to live with it. In 1994, I was 17 years old, living in Pocatello, Idaho. At the time, I was staying with my fiancé's parents in their old, unfinished 2-story house. It sat at the end of a dead-end street, one of only 4 houses in that secluded little pocket. My fiancé had gotten into trouble with the law and was sent away for 8 months, leaving me with no real choice but to stay with his family. Given my own difficult home situation, I didn't have many options, but if I had, I probably wouldn't have chosen to stay there. That fall, something happened that, looking back, might have set everything into motion. A local cemetery had been vandalized by a couple of teenagers, and several tombstones had been destroyed, including my fiancé's grandfather's. His father, trying to save money, decided to take the broken pieces home and repair them himself. He pieced together what he could and placed them in a makeshift wooden box in the basement, where he often worked on projects. It wasn't long after that when I had my first encounter with what I can only assume was my fiancé's grandfather. One night, I was in my room, getting ready for bed. Another teenager living in the house had stopped by my room to say goodnight, and before leaving, he asked if I wanted him to turn the light off. Without thinking much about it, I told him it was fine. He left, and the room was plunged into darkness. I sat on my bed, letting my eyes adjust, when suddenly I heard a loud thud from the far end of the room. I turned my gaze in that direction, trying to make out what had caused the sound. That's when I saw it, a dark figure standing motionless in the moonlight. It had no distinct facial features, but I could feel it staring at me. My heart pounded, fear taking hold of me. The only way out of the room was to pass right by it, and I didn't dare move. In a moment of panic, I convinced myself that if I just got under the covers and turned my back to it, maybe it would go away. I slid into bed and pulled the blanket over my head, trying to steady my breathing. But then I heard footsteps. The sound of hurried, scurrying steps rushed across the room and stopped right beside my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, every nerve in my body on edge. My breathing felt too loud, too obvious. Then I heard it move to the foot of my bed. I didn't dare look, didn't dare acknowledge it. My heart was pounding so violently I thought it might burst. In sheer desperation, I started pretending to snore, hoping that if I seemed asleep, it would lose interest and leave. For a few agonizing moments, the room was silent. Then I felt it. The bed sank. The mattress shifted as if someone had climbed in beside me. I kept snoring, kept my eyes shut, kept willing myself not to scream. At some point, I must have passed out from fear because when I woke up the next morning, the room was empty, and daylight had returned. But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had heard. And I knew I never wanted to be alone in that room again. Luckily, another girl staying in the house asked if she could move into my room with me. I agreed immediately, grateful for the company. I told her what had happened, and she became uneasy, but we made a pact. If either of us needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, we would always go together. It wasn't long before she experienced something herself. One night, she got up to use the bathroom while I waited in the living room. As I sat there alone, I heard something, the unmistakable sound of the basement door opening and closing. My stomach clenched. I sat completely still, hoping it was just my fiancé's mother checking on the house. I listened closely, waiting to hear her footsteps follow, waiting for the sound of her bedroom door closing. But I heard nothing. A few moments later, my roommate returned from the bathroom and immediately asked, "Did you close that door?" I was about to answer when we both froze. The basement door opened again, then closed. Then came the sound of heavy, running footsteps down the hallway, directly toward us. We bolted for the stairs, pushing and tripping over each other in our desperate attempt to get away. When we made it to my room, we slammed the door shut and agreed we would hold it in from now on. No more midnight bathroom trips. Over the next 8 months, things remained unsettling, but we managed to avoid direct encounters. My fiancé's mother, however, started mentioning that she had been hearing things, too. She never went into detail, but I could tell she was uneasy. Then, years later, I found myself back in that house. It was 10 years after my first encounter. My ex-husband and I were moving from Missouri to Boise, and as we passed through Pocatello, we needed a place to stay. His parents were still there, so we spent the night in the same house I had feared for so long. Our children stayed in the next room over while we took the room at the top of the stairs. Just as we were settling into bed, we heard it. Heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, ascending the stairs. We immediately knew it wasn't his parents. They were older now, and moving like that would have been difficult for them. My first thought was that it was our oldest son returning from the bathroom, stomping his way back to bed. My ex-husband got up and opened the door to tell him to quiet down. But no one was there. He checked on the boys. They were fast asleep. The moment he shut the door, the footsteps started again. He flung the door open, still nothing. The hallway was empty. He checked on the boys once more. Still asleep. Then, just as he was about to shut the door, something pushed back. The door was being forced open from the other side. He yanked it shut, and suddenly, the hallway erupted in noise. The sound of something sprinting up and down, slamming into the walls as it went. We sat frozen, listening. Then came the smell. A rancid, rotten stench filled the room. It was unbearable, like something decayed. I gagged, covering my nose. I asked my ex if he could smell it, but he said he couldn't. The more I mentioned it, the stronger it became, until I was nearly retching. Desperate to find the source, we tore the room apart, convinced it had to be a dead mouse or something hidden somewhere. But there was nothing. That putrid smell lingered all night. The next morning, we left as fast as we could. That was the last time I ever set foot in that house. My ex-husband's parents passed away years later, and the family finally replaced his grandfather's headstone. I still wonder about the new tenants. Have they ever had visitors? Do they hear the footsteps? The running? The knocking? Or has whatever was there finally found peace? Somehow I doubt it. I live in a small provincial town, almost more of a settlement, deep in the heart of Russia. Life here moves at a slow, predictable pace, much like in many semi-rural places across the world. Though quiet and peaceful on the surface, the town has been feeling the growing impact of urbanization over the years, a process I personally find unsettling. New shops, stores, and retail centers keep popping up in places where they aren't really needed, filling the town with unnecessary commercial spaces. One such place is a shopping center called Iridescent, or Raduzny, in Russian. It's supposedly named after the rainbow, yet there's nothing colorful about it. The building's walls are a dull mix of beige shades, gradually shifting from light to dark. It lacks personality, just another soulless structure standing against the town's skyline. For reasons I couldn't quite explain at first, I hated going there. The structure itself felt unwelcoming. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with an artificial stillness. It wasn't abandoned, far from it, but something about it gave me the unsettling impression that the building held secrets. Inside, the shopping center mostly housed clothing stores, along with a small gardening shop and a hairdresser. The only reason I ever stepped inside was because of Elle, my longtime hairdresser. She had been cutting my hair since childhood, and I had always trusted her completely. She was a kind and gentle woman, the sort of person who radiates warmth even in the coldest of places. Elle had spent many years working in a different building, which also doubled as the town's post office. It was a place she had become deeply attached to, filled with familiar customers and old memories. But for reasons beyond her control, she was forced to move her business to Iridescent. And while she accepted the change, I found myself deeply uneasy about it. I wasn't sure why, but the very thought of stepping inside Iridescent made me uncomfortable. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a quiet, unshakable sense of dread. Objectively speaking, there wasn't anything obviously wrong with the place. Yes, the corridors were narrow, and the layout was claustrophobic, but that alone couldn't explain the feeling. Still, I convinced myself I was being irrational. Elle was there, and I trusted her. As long as I was in her company, I felt somewhat safe. But my unease deepened with time. Every visit to Iridescent seemed to come with its own small misfortunes. Once, I ran into a person I had been hoping to avoid, an interaction that left me irritated for the rest of the day. Another time, I was dragged into an awkward conversation with near strangers, forced to exchange pleasantries with people I barely knew. These were minor inconveniences, sure, but the pattern made me wonder, was it really just bad luck? Or was this place actively pushing me away? Then came the whispers. Not literal ones, at least not at first. But every now and then, while waiting in the cramped corridors, I would feel an odd sensation, as if someone was watching me. The feeling would creep up my spine and settle in my chest, making the air feel heavy. My instincts told me to leave, to get out of there, but my logical mind dismissed it. One day, Elle moved her business again, this time to the first floor of a cafe just outside of Iridescent. At first, this seemed like a relief. It wasn't far, but at least it wasn't inside that awful place anymore. But soon, I noticed something disturbing. The cafe below her shop had become a gathering place for shady people, alcoholics, drifters, and men whose eyes carried the weight of hidden violence. They loitered outside at odd hours, their presence turning the air thick with unease. It wasn't unusual for this part of town, but something about this particular group felt off. Then Elle was kicked out again. I remember the day she told me. Her voice trembled, and she barely held back tears as she explained that the property owner had demanded an outrageous increase in rent, far beyond what she could afford. It was clear she had been forced out, pushed from one unstable place to another. I felt awful for her, but at the same time, a part of me felt relief. At least now, either of us would have to step foot in Iridescent again. Or so I thought. The first time I visited Elle at her new location, far from that cursed building, we finally talked about what had been happening. That's when she told me everything. While working at Iridescent, both she and other traders had experienced strange occurrences. They would frequently hear footsteps, clear, deliberate footsteps, in areas that should have been empty. The building had multiple floors, but the upper sections had been completely vacant for some time. Yet, that was exactly where the sounds came from. Elle swore that the footsteps weren't just vague noises. They were distinct, as if someone, or something, was pacing just above them. At first, the traders dismissed it as a trick of the acoustics, but then, things started moving. Clothes on display would shift, as if an invisible hand had brushed against them. Items would fall for no reason. One merchant even claimed that his wares had been rearranged overnight, though no one had been in the shop after closing. And then, someone finally spoke about the history of that land. Before Iridescent was built, something terrible had happened there. A young girl had been raped and murdered on that very spot. Her killer was never found. Some believe that her restless spirit still haunted the area, lingering in the spaces where she had suffered. Before Iridescent was built, there had been a school on that land. Perhaps that was where it had happened. The school was eventually demolished, leaving the space empty for years. Until Iridescent was constructed. I told Elle about my feelings of unease, about how I had hated the place long before I even knew its history. She only nodded. "Maybe you can sense these things," she said. I had never considered myself psychic, but I was a sensitive person. Could it be that I had somehow felt the presence of that spirit? Of course, skeptics would dismiss all of this as coincidence. Maybe my bad experiences there were random misfortunes. Maybe Elle's business struggles were just bad luck. Maybe the footsteps were just sounds of the old building shifting. But when you put it all together, the history of the land, the eerie noises, the unexplained movements, it all paints a different picture. And that picture still haunts me. Because Iridescent still stands to this day. And I can't help but wonder, is she still there? When my uncle and his family decided to demolish their ancestral home and rebuild it, they had no idea that the house they would temporarily move into would bring them face to face with something unnatural. The old house, over 20 to 30 years old, was falling apart, leaky ceilings, cracked walls, and endless repairs. Since rebuilding on the same land was their only option, they found a rented house in the same lane. It was strangely large, almost too good to be true, especially considering the low rent of just 5,000 rupees per month. But at the time, that didn't seem like a red flag. It was just a great deal. Or so they thought. My grandmother was reluctant to move. She was deeply attached to the old house and feared they were selling it off rather than rebuilding. She was uneasy about leaving, and though she eventually agreed, her unhappiness with the move was obvious. It wasn't long before she started seeing something strange in their new home. At first, she mentioned seeing a shadowy figure, semi-transparent, moving through the house. It wasn't just in the corners of her vision, it was clear, distinct. But when she told the family, everyone laughed. They thought she was just trying to convince them to go back to the old house. No one took her words seriously. But she kept seeing it. And soon, she wasn't the only one. One afternoon, my grandmother and my aunt were lying in the hall, taking an afternoon nap. My grandmother, restless, woke up to a disturbance in the room. And then she saw it. Standing in the dim light, watching her, was a woman. Pale, ghostly, white. For a moment, she was frozen in terror. Then, without warning, the figure moved toward my sleeping aunt. My grandmother watched in horror as the apparition climbed on top of her, pressing down on her neck. My aunt gasped, struggling for breath, unable to scream. Panicked, my grandmother ran to the puja, prayer, room, grabbed a portrait of a Hindu god, and threw it on my aunt. In an instant, the ghost vanished. When my aunt finally woke up, she didn't remember any of it. But she believed my grandmother now. They both told my uncle, hoping he would finally understand that something was wrong with the house. But he dismissed their claims, insisting they were imagining things. He thought my grandmother had filled my aunt's head with nonsense. But then, more things started happening. It wasn't just my grandmother and my aunt anymore. My uncle's 3 daughters started seeing the ghost too. The only person who didn't see it was my uncle. Eventually, my mother visited them after hearing all the stories. She wasn't scared. She didn't believe in ghosts. She spent the day there and didn't experience anything strange. But that night, when everyone slept on the floor in the hall, she woke up to something pulling her blanket. Terrified, she held it tightly, reciting every prayer she could think of, refusing to look up. She had never experienced anything like this before. At some point, she drifted back into sleep, exhausted from fear. When she returned home, she told me and my brothers everything. A week later, I decided to stay in the house myself. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories had made me curious. If something really was in that house, I wanted to see it for myself. That night, I stayed up until 2 a.m., walking around the lawn, sitting on the terrace, searching for anything out of the ordinary. I expected to feel something, a presence, a cold spot, anything. But nothing happened. Whatever was haunting the house did not want to show itself to me. Maybe because I didn't believe. Maybe because I was expecting it. I even joked that the ghost was too shy to face me. But my uncle's family didn't have that luxury. One day, they attended a wedding in the same neighborhood. My uncle casually mentioned the rented house they were living in, explaining that they had shifted there until their new home was built. That's when an older man in the neighborhood overheard the conversation and became furious. He scolded my uncle, calling him irresponsible for not knowing the history of the house. Confused, my uncle asked what he meant. The man looked at him and said, "4 people have died in the bathroom of that house." Now, everything made sense. The suspiciously low rent, the strange occurrences, the entity tormenting his family. It was all connected. For the first time, my uncle was forced to believe. He had ignored all the warnings before, but now, he knew they had to leave. But they didn't leave fast enough. One day, my uncle had a serious argument with his eldest daughter. He felt she was going down the wrong path and gave her a lecture about the struggles he had faced in life. Afterward, he, my aunt, and their 2 younger daughters left for a meditation center, leaving my grandmother and eldest cousin alone in the house. That day, something horrible happened. My cousin, just 15 years old, went into the bathroom. The same bathroom where 4 others had died. There, she poured turpentine oil and another flammable liquid over herself. And then, she set herself on fire. By the time the family found her, it was too late. They rushed her to the hospital, but she had severe burns. She fought for 4 days. Then she died. It happened on March 23, 2013. No one knows why she did it. But we do know where she did it. The same cursed bathroom. The same haunted house. Was it just depression? Or did something drive her to do it? No one will ever know. But one thing is certain, they never should have moved into that house. When I completed my basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in late 2011, I was soon stationed at Fort Eustis, Virginia, for my military job training at the Army Aviation Logistics School. Since I had to stay on base during the week, my wife, Nicole, lived in an apartment off base. After months of training, I received orders to be stationed in Hawaii with the 25th Infantry Division. It was sudden, leaving little time for preparation, but we were both thrilled at the thought of living in Hawaii. It felt like a dream, moving to paradise, with beaches, mountains, and endless adventure ahead. We packed up, shipped our furniture and car, said goodbye to our families, and before we knew it, we were on a one-way flight to Oahu. As the plane descended, we saw Waikiki Beach, Diamond Head Volcano, and Pearl Harbor from the sky. It was surreal, almost too good to be true. Once we arrived, I had to go through the usual military processing, paperwork, immunizations, and briefings, before reporting to my new unit. Meanwhile, we found a rental home in Kapolei, a quiet, beautiful neighborhood just minutes from the beach. It felt perfect. Our belongings arrived quickly, and we settled in, ready to enjoy our new life. But things didn't stay perfect for long. My unit was ramping up for a deployment to Afghanistan, which meant long hours on base and weeks of training on other islands. Nicole spent most of her days alone, so to keep herself busy, she decided to adopt 2 dogs from the ASPCA. Both were pit bull mixes, and despite their breed's reputation, they were gentle, affectionate, and loving. They became her companions and protectors, keeping her company when I was away. We spent weekends exploring Oahu's trails, beaches, and historical sites. One day, we ventured into Barber's Point, a large, overgrown area near our home. Something about the place felt wrong. It was eerily quiet, and beneath the overgrown vegetation, we realized the ground was not soil, but old asphalt, the remains of a long-abandoned military staging area from World War II. Railroad tracks ran toward the beach, with trees growing through the wooden beams. It was like walking through a ghost town. Even in the daylight, the air felt heavy. We could almost hear the echoes of men shouting orders, engines roaring, and machines clanking, sounds of a past long gone but somehow still lingering. Later, we researched the area and learned that it had been a major supply depot for battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where thousands of men had been sent off to storm Japanese beaches, many never returning. We had heard legends of haunted places in Hawaii, but we brushed them off as superstition. The island's history was rich in spirits and folklore, especially the night marchers, phantom warriors said to roam the land at night. But we weren't superstitious. That is, until we made a terrible mistake. One night, feeling bored, we pulled out a Ouija board. At first, it seemed like harmless fun. "Is there a spirit here who would like to communicate?" we asked. The planchette moved to yes. "Are you good or evil?" It slid toward the moon symbol. "How did you die?" The board spelled out a 3-digit number. We asked again, thinking we had misread it. It spelled out the same number. Over and over. Feeling uneasy, we asked, "Can you give us a sign if you are here?" At that moment, the floor lamp flickered on, then shut off immediately. Every question we asked after that, the planchette only moved to the moon symbol. Realizing we had made a mistake, we quickly closed the session and put the board away. That night marked the beginning of the horror. At first, it was the dogs. They started acting strangely, staring into dark hallways, refusing to enter certain rooms, and growling at nothing. One night, I woke up to a deep growl at the foot of the bed. At first, I assumed one of the dogs was dreaming. But when I shined my phone's light, I saw my dog sitting rigidly, ears perked, eyes locked onto something in the hallway. He wasn't just staring, he was looking up, as if making eye contact with something unseen. Another night, I woke up to even worse growling. This time, when I shined my light, I realized he was staring at the attic door, a simple wooden panel in my closet ceiling. Something was up there. It escalated quickly. Every morning, at 4:30 a.m., I would wake up to let the dogs outside before heading to base. One morning, as we reached the bottom of the stairs, the dogs suddenly froze in place. They were staring into the dark living room, motionless. "Come on, boys, let's go outside," I said, patting my thigh. But they refused to move. Their gaze was fixed on one spot in the corner, a spot too dark to see anything. And then, they bolted upstairs, scrambling and slipping on the hardwood, desperate to get away. I flipped on the light. There was nothing there. But I felt it. An overwhelming presence, standing inches behind me, staring at the back of my head. Nicole started experiencing sleep paralysis, waking up unable to move, her chest crushed under an invisible weight. Our dog Milo started sleeping right beside her, refusing to leave her side. Even in the mornings when I let them out, he wouldn't budge. Then I heard it. One night, as I got ready for bed, I casually said, "I'll turn on some warm water." A second later, a metallic, robotic voice repeated from a foot away, "Warm water." I froze. Yeah, warm water, shut up," I mocked. The activity exploded. One night, while Nicole was lying in bed, she watched as our cat suddenly went stiff, then freaked out, eyes locked onto something in the hallway. She followed its gaze. A tall, black mass with glowing red eyes rose from the stairs, drifted into the hallway, and disappeared into the bathroom. Then came the voices. Loud, blaring male voices, as if coming from a giant speaker system, but only inside our house. They sounded distorted, almost like static mixed with screaming. It was deafening, shaking the walls, but our neighbors heard nothing. One night I finally saw it. A shadow figure, with glowing red eyes, standing against the bedroom wall behind Nicole. It darted into the laundry room. The next morning, I had enough. I walked downstairs in total darkness, determined to confront whatever was there. I felt it, crouching in the farthest corner of the living room. It scrambled into the laundry room. I followed. And there it was, curled up against the wall, knees to its chest, staring at me. A black, inhuman mass. For the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was furious. "You are not welcome here! You are dead! Now get out!" I watched as it fell backward into the wall, disappearing completely. After that, it never came back. Nicole's sleep paralysis stopped. The dog stopped growling at nothing. The house felt normal again. We no longer lived there. But I'll never forget the entity that haunted our home in Hawaii. It was the summer break after my freshman year of high school in 2017 when my mom and I decided to take a trip to New York. I hadn't even been in the US for a full year yet, so my mom wanted to take me around to different states like New York and New Jersey to explore. I was excited. Seeing the big cities was a completely new experience for me. At the same time, I had recently developed an interest in haunted places and paranormal stories. I spent a lot of time reading about them online, and during our trip, I came across the Amityville house. I had heard about the infamous murders that happened there, and how it inspired movies and books, but I had never actually seen them. Still, the legend fascinated me, and since we were already in New York, I convinced my mom that we should go see it in person. She agreed, and we drove out to Long Island to find the house. When we arrived, the sky was cloudy, and the air felt eerily still. Knowing that an entire family had been murdered inside made the whole place feel unsettling. I took out my phone and started recording, wanting to take some pictures and videos to brag to my friends later. A police car patrolled the area, probably to keep people from trespassing, so we didn't stick around for long. After a few minutes of just standing there, staring at the house, we got back in the car and headed back to our hotel. Nothing strange happened, at least, not yet. Later that night, I sat on my bed scrolling through the pictures and videos I had taken. One particular video caught my attention. Curious, I zoomed in on the windows of the house, examining each one closely. Then I saw it. In one of the windows, a white, smoke-like shape moved back and forth before vanishing into thin air. I watched it over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a reflection, and it wasn't someone inside the house. The movement was too smooth, too unnatural. There was nothing around that could have let out smoke like that, and yet there it was, floating in the window. I felt my stomach drop. I called my mom over and showed her the video. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God!" she muttered, visibly shaken. As much as I was interested in the paranormal, I always liked to stay skeptical. But this was something different. It reminded me of Anabi, the floating fire spirits from Japanese folklore. I wasn't sure what it was, but the more I stared at it, the more I felt uneasy. I decided to post the video on my spam Instagram account, asking my friends what they thought. A few of them DM'd me immediately. "That's definitely not smoke. Dude, what the hell is that? That looks real." The more people confirmed what I was seeing, the more unsettling it became. I had actually caught something on camera. And yet I tried not to think too much about it. I told myself it was just some weird trick of the light. Eventually, I forgot about it. Until about a year and a half later. One day, out of nowhere, I remembered the video and thought it would be cool to post it on Reddit. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my camera roll. But the video wasn't there. I frowned, searching through every folder, but it was completely gone. Confused, I logged into my old spam account, thinking I could just download it from my post. It was missing there too. I checked everywhere. My cloud storage, my backup files, even my old messages with friends who had seen it. Nothing. I hadn't switched phones. I hadn't deleted it. It was just gone. Frustrated, I asked my mom if she remembered the video. Without hesitation, she said, "Of course I remember. How could I forget that? I was mad at you for losing it." I even reached out to the friends who had seen my post. Every single one of them said the same thing. "Yeah, I remember that video. It was creepy as hell." Yet, none of us had a copy. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened to that video. I still remember what I saw, clear as day. But somehow, for some reason, the evidence was erased. Visiting my great-aunt Edith's house is always an experience, one that's hard to forget. She's a hoarder, though not as extreme as those you see on TV. Still, finding a place to sit without moving a pile of personal belongings is a challenge. Edith, now in her late 80s, has lived in Dalton since the early 1960s. She's the sweetest woman you could meet, and if you visit her, you're guaranteed to leave a few pounds heavier. She firmly believes that everyone is always hungry. Her house wasn't always the cluttered maze it is today. When she was married to her first husband, it was a simple split-level home. The second floor held all the bedrooms, while the garage sat below. The kitchen, living room, and dining room were on the first floor. There were stairs leading to a finished basement, or so I'm told. I say that because, for my entire life, I've never seen the basement. Piles of clutter have always blocked the entryway. I know it exists only because there's a door labeled the basement door. According to my mother, Edith wasn't always a hoarder. That changed when her first husband died suddenly from a heart attack in the early 1970s. My mom was only 9 at the time, but she remembers seeing strange things in that house afterward. One experience has always stuck with me. A week or two after the funeral, my mom was sleeping in the guest bedroom when she was woken up by the overwhelming scent of flowers. It was so strong that she struggled to breathe. She rubbed her eyes, sat up, and saw her uncle's reflection in the mirror. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring towards the open doorway, where the light from the hall spilled in. She said he was wearing his funeral suit. Maybe he was looking for Edith. Fear took over, but she didn't scream. Instead, she pulled the covers over her head and stayed there. When I asked her why she didn't run, she said she was more afraid of waking her mother than she was of seeing a ghost. She never told Edith. She knew how heartbroken she was and didn't want to upset her more. In 1975, Edith remarried, but her second husband didn't live long either. He passed away from a brain tumor. Before he died, he made some major renovations to the house. From the street, it looked like a normal-sized home, but the backyard stretched far. He built a long hallway, a new family room, and an expanded master bedroom at the back of the house. One odd feature of the renovations was a mirror-lined hallway. Every inch, from floor to ceiling, was covered in frameless mirrors, reflecting into infinity. Even in complete darkness, there was no escaping your reflection. As I got older, I visited Edith less often. But one visit in 2001, when I was 20, still haunts me. My mom and I stayed at Edith's house for a family wedding. The house was packed, and I had to sleep on an antique Victorian-style couch in the new living room. It looked elegant, but it was horribly uncomfortable. I tossed and turned for hours, trying to fall asleep. Then I heard footsteps in the old living room. The sound was steady and deliberate, not the random creaks of an old house. Whoever it was, they were walking towards me, not just wandering aimlessly. From where I lay, I could see a small portion of the old living room through the mirror-lined hallway. As the footsteps reached the mirrors, I instinctively closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. I wasn't in the mood for a late-night conversation with a relative. But then, I peeked. No one was there. The hallway was empty, yet the footsteps continued. They moved closer, right to the threshold of the room where I was lying. Still, nothing was there. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just the sound of someone moving upstairs, but I knew better. That part of the house was only one story. There was no upstairs. Edith had nightlights everywhere, so there were no deep shadows to hide in. If someone had been standing there, I would have seen them. But I saw nothing. And yet, I felt someone there. A presence. Watching. I didn't panic. Somehow, I knew that whoever, or whatever, was there meant no harm. I rolled over, put on my headphones, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. I never told Edith what happened. Years later, in 2019, I visited her again. The house was even more cluttered than before. She had remarried, at 85. Her husband was 89, but he didn't live with her because he physically couldn't move through the house. I don't believe there's anything to fear in Edith's house. If those footsteps belonged to someone, I think they were residual, a lingering imprint of the past. That hallway used to be a small porch, and maybe my great-uncle had a habit of standing there. If he's still there, maybe he's just watching over Edith, making sure she's happy. I am a 33-year-old man living in Massachusetts with my 8-year-old son. Recently, my girlfriend and her 3 children, ages 9, 7, and 4, moved in with us. The kids stay with us a little over half the time since we both share custody with our exes. I've lived in this house for 9 years. Part of that time I was married, but mostly I've been single. Along with us, I have 3 well-trained dogs. They are protective of our home and family, especially when we're not around. Since the day I moved into this house, I have been seeing dark shadows in my bedroom at night. These shadows vary in size. Some appear as tall as a person, while others are massive, taking up a quarter of the ceiling, usually in a corner above my bed. They move in an odd way, gliding and swirling like the wax in a lava lamp. Most nights, they circle around my bed, sometimes gathering near the ceiling, other times standing at the foot or side of the bed. A few times they've come so close that my vision was completely blocked, as if I was face to face with them. But they have no faces, no details, just a misty, shifting form. Even when they take the shape of a man-sized figure, their outline is never defined, more like a swirling cloud than a human silhouette. I've always felt uneasy in their presence, but never genuinely afraid. I know it's not just my imagination because I've had other people witness them too. Whenever I see them, I make sure I'm fully awake, blinking several times and rubbing my eyes to rule out any tricks of the mind in the darkness of the room. I do believe in the paranormal, but I'm also skeptical. My first thought is never that it's a ghost or something supernatural. Recently, these shadows have started appearing more frequently, and stranger things have begun happening in the house. I have heard footsteps when I was home alone, with my dogs either asleep or in my line of sight. The dogs react, their ears perk up as if they hear something too, but they don't bark. They don't seem alarmed, just curious, as if they are trying to understand where the sound is coming from. Some nights, I wake up to what sounds like people talking in the living room. I assume I left the television on, so I get up to turn it off, only to find complete silence. The TV is off. The sound stops the moment I get close, as if whatever was making the noise knows I'm approaching. The strangest thing happened just a week ago. A glass dish had been drying on the dish rack for hours. It had been washed, left to air dry, and sat undisturbed at room temperature. At around 2:30 a.m., I was in the living room while my girlfriend was in the bedroom when suddenly, the dish shattered. No, exploded would be a better word for it. The sound was so loud that it woke my girlfriend from the other side of the house. The sudden pop of breaking glass sent a shock through me. When I checked, I was stunned. The dish wasn't just broken, it had shattered into pieces that scattered 15 feet away. Other dishes on the rack remained untouched, as if nothing had disturbed them. There were no open windows, no vents nearby that could have caused the temperature change. There was no logical explanation for why it would break so violently. I've tried to find a rational reason for everything that has been happening, but I am at a loss. These shadows, the footsteps, the voices, and now this, whatever is going on in my house, I can't explain it. Waking up in the middle of the night with a burning sensation on my arm was something I never expected. It was just a little before 3 a.m., and the pain jolted me out of my sleep. Still groggy and confused, I reached over to touch my left arm, which was hanging over the side of the bed. The moment my fingers brushed against it, I flinched. It was wet and stinging, as if it were bleeding. Panic shot through me as I sat up in the dark, my heart pounding. What the heck just happened? I jumped out of bed and ran straight to the bathroom, flipping on the lights. Staring at my reflection in the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. There was no blood, but the lower part of my arm was burned. A long red welt stretched across my skin, already beginning to blister. The pain was sharp and deep, unlike anything I had ever felt before. I had no idea how something like this could happen. My boyfriend came rushing in, his face pale as he stared at my arm in disbelief. He has never believed in the paranormal before. He kept asking what happened, but I had no answers. I quickly applied some burn ointment to ease the pain, while he grabbed his phone to take a picture. He was so freaked out that he refused to sleep in our bedroom that night. Instead, he grabbed a pillow and blanket and moved into the spare room, leaving me alone, shaken, and sitting on the couch with the TV on, too afraid to go back to bed. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to me, but it was the worst. Years ago, I had experienced scratches, but this was different. This was an attack. That night in December 2016 left me terrified. Over the following days, the burn blistered, popped open, and became incredibly painful. I tried reaching out to paranormal investigators, calling every number I could find, but no one ever returned my calls. The only person who answered was a producer from the Dead Files, but they said they couldn't investigate because we didn't own the house at the time. For a while, things settled down, and I hoped that whatever had caused these experiences had moved on. But then, in November 2019, the activity returned. One night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard tiny bells jingling. The sound was faint but unmistakable. I had no bells in my room, at least, none that I could remember. The next morning, I searched my room and found a strip of cloth with tiny bells attached, something I had cut off an old blouse. That had to be what I heard, right? But just a few nights later, the sound came again, only this time, it was right beside me. The moment my head hit the pillow, a bell jingled in my ear. Fear shot through me. I jumped up, turned on the light, nothing. The next day, I remembered something else. I had an old walking stick with a tiny bell attached. It had been across the room from my bed the whole time. I moved it out of my room immediately. I didn't want to take any chances. Then, on November 7th, something happened that left me absolutely speechless. I was lounging in my recliner, watching TV, when I felt a sharp jab in my left leg, as if something had stabbed me. The pain made me yelp out loud, and I instinctively rubbed my leg with my other foot. I hadn't moved, and nothing had touched me. Confused, I tried to shake it off, not knowing what to think. I left my leg hanging over the side of the chair for a while, trying to ignore the strange pain. Eventually, I got up to grab something from the kitchen. When I came back, I froze. There were 3 large drops of blood on the carpet, directly in front of my chair. Panic started creeping in as I bent down to clean it up. That's when I noticed something even worse. Blood was all over both of my legs and smeared onto my nightgown. I hadn't noticed it before. I lifted my nightgown and finally saw it, a small wound on my leg that had been bleeding freely. But how? I didn't feel a cut, I hadn't hit anything, nothing sharp was anywhere near me. I felt helpless. I don't understand why this keeps happening to me. I've tried talking to people about it, but no one seems to have answers. I feel completely alone in this. What could be causing this? Why is it happening to me? It was around 2013 when this happened. We had rented a school near a funeral home for our dance practice and planned to stay overnight. There were around 15 of us, laughing and playing, enjoying the practice. At one point, my friend and I sat on the stage, watching the dancers. That's when I felt something strange, like someone was watching us from behind. At first I ignored it, but soon I noticed a cold breeze against my back, as if someone was running back and forth behind us. It wasn't just a normal draft, it felt different, like movement that wasn't supposed to be there. Our choreographer suddenly called for a break and walked over to us. He looked serious and asked if we had felt anything. Before I could answer, he said there were eyes watching us and that a child was running behind us. He told us not to pay attention to them. The way he said it so casually made me uneasy. He wasn't asking if we had seen something, he already knew. An hour later, during another break, I happened to look up and saw something that made my heart stop. In the school's library, there was a glowing woman looking at us. Her face wasn't clear, but her eyes were locked onto us. The way she stared felt unnatural, almost like she was glaring. I kept looking at her, unable to look away, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My friend, sitting beside me, suddenly whispered, asking if I could see the woman standing in the library. The fear in her voice told me she was seeing exactly what I was. We immediately called the choreographer over and told him about the woman. He simply told us to stop looking at her. He asked us to pray silently so that the other dancers wouldn't panic. We followed his instructions, and the rest of the night went on without any more incidents, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we had seen. The next night, we had another practice at the same school gym. My friend and I went out to buy snacks and water for everyone. As we returned to the stage to set everything down, I saw a shadow move across the stage, from one corner to the other. My body tensed, and my eyes widened as I stared at the spot where it had been. Before I could even say anything, my friend asked if I had seen it too. Without saying a word, I turned and ran. I didn't care about the snacks anymore. We sprinted toward the entrance and stopped at the guard's table. Trying to catch my breath, I asked him directly if the school was haunted. He just shook his head and told us there was nothing to worry about. We didn't believe him. We had both seen the shadow. We stayed near the guard for a while, talking to calm ourselves down. His table was near the entrance gate, and just beside him was the restroom. After some time, my friend said she needed to use the restroom. The guard warned her that the lights inside were broken. He said they stopped replacing the bulbs because they kept going out on their own. She hesitated but went inside anyway, while I stood at the entrance with a flashlight, shining it inside so she could see. A few moments later, she suddenly gasped and whispered that someone had just touched her hair. My heart started pounding as I froze in place. It was just the two of us in the restroom. She rushed out, her face pale, tears in her eyes. The guard, noticing her fear, tried to lighten the mood with some jokes. We laughed a little, trying to push away the fear. Then, suddenly, the restroom door slammed shut with a loud bang. We both screamed. There was no wind, nothing that could have caused the door to move like that. If it had been the wind, why had only that one door slammed shut? We had no explanation. Shocked and terrified, we ran back to the gym. My friend couldn't hold back her tears. The choreographer noticed right away and asked if we had seen the woman near the restroom. We told him we hadn't seen anything, only experienced strange things. He looked troubled and said the woman was there, but she was angry. He described her appearance, saying she was covered in blood. His words made my skin crawl. Later that night, on the way home, my friend texted me, saying she felt like someone was following her. Every time she turned around, no one was there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She ran home as fast as she could, but even after locking the door behind her, she felt like something was still watching her. The next morning, she told me she had terrible nightmares about a girl crying for help near the school. We mentioned it to a classmate, who looked surprised and asked if we had seen anything unusual the night before. We hesitated but said no. That's when she told us that a gym instructor had died near the school. A cold chill ran through me. I immediately called the choreographer and asked him again about the woman he saw. His description matched exactly what our classmate had said the gym instructor had been wearing the day she died. I was in New York City on a haunted tour, where we walked through different areas while our guide told us eerie ghost stories. Being fascinated by the supernatural, I was completely absorbed in hearing about all the spooky activity that had been reported in the older parts of the city. We learned about gruesome murders and the restless spirits said to still linger where the tragedies took place. One of the stops was one of the oldest graveyards in the city. I didn't see anything there at the time, but I took some pictures and later, when I looked closely, I'm almost certain I could see ghostly faces staring at us through the gates. But it was on Gay Street where I actually saw something. This street became famous in the 1920s, partly because of the city's mayor at the time, who was known to be a big party animal. He had a mistress who lived there, and they would throw extravagant parties, filling the house with music, dancing, and high society guests. Over the years, many people have reported seeing a man in a top hat strutting down the street with a cane, just as the real mayor used to do. The idea of a ghostly figure reliving the glamour of the Roaring Twenties was fascinating to me. I kind of loved the drama of it. When we arrived on Gay Street, I was excited. I've always been drawn to the 1920s, and I had heard so much about this particular mayor. A part of me was almost expecting to see him casually strolling toward me. Of course, I didn't. But I did see something else. After taking in the atmosphere of the street, I turned back to get another look at the house where all those legendary parties had taken place. That's when I saw it, an arm in the window. It was unmistakable. It was bent at an angle, as if it were dancing, almost like the "walk like an Egyptian" dance with the wrist turned outward. The strange thing was that it appeared more like a shadow or silhouette, yet it was perfectly clear. I could see the movement for just a few seconds, and as soon as I turned to tell someone else, it was gone. I wasn't scared. If anything, I was thrilled. Moments like these don't happen often, and I love the rush of seeing something unexplainable. I immediately took several pictures of the house from the outside, hoping to capture something else. I didn't see any arms in the photos, though I thought I might have caught an orb. But after looking at it a few times, I figured it was probably just the way the light reflected. It wasn't until months later that I discovered something even stranger. I was showing my friend the pictures from that night, retelling the story, when she suddenly stopped me and said, "Wait, do you see that?" She zoomed in on the top floor window of the house, and my stomach dropped. There, faint but visible, was the face of a man looking out, right in the direction where I had been standing. He had the look of a captain, with a distinct hat that gave off a historical, commanding presence. We went through all the photos, and to our shock, he was in multiple pictures. The angle shifted slightly, making it seem as though he was moving between the windows. It was eerie. I had looked at these photos so many times, never noticing him before. But now that I had, I couldn't unsee it. It made me wonder how many spirits were lingering inside that house, and why they stayed. The energy of the place didn't feel dark or heavy. It didn't seem like a place haunted by tragedy or sadness. If anything, it felt like a house where a grand party never truly ended. And honestly, if I had the choice, spending my afterlife dancing and celebrating in an endless 1920s party doesn't sound so bad. When I was little, my older sister and I used to stay over at our grandparents' house all the time. I was only 5 years old, and she was 7. Our youngest sister was still too young for sleepovers, so it was just the two of us. Whenever we stayed, we had to share a room and a bed. The room was on the second floor, right next to the bathroom and our grandparents' bedroom. To most people, it seemed like a normal room, nothing out of the ordinary. But for some reason, it always felt off. The first time we slept over, I didn't think much of it. Some people say I was too young to remember things properly, or that I just imagined it all. I believed that too, until years later. When my younger sister was finally old enough to start sleeping over, my grandmother didn't let her use that room. She had sealed it off, saying it was best if no one stayed there anymore. She shut the room down because of what I had seen. Because every time I stayed there, I ended up waking the whole house screaming. It all started the very first night we slept over. My sister and I were excited but nervous, our first night away from home. We got tucked into bed, our grandfather went to sleep early, and our grandmother stayed up for a while. My sister and I lay awake talking for a few minutes, but before I knew it, she was fast asleep. And just like that, I was alone. I rolled over to get more space on the bed and happened to glance toward the lamp in the room. It was a tall lamp, and soft light from outside spilled onto it through the window. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the shadow behind the light. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I stared, the dark figure standing there became clearer. He was tall, completely black like a shadow, and wore a top hat. I couldn't see any other features, just that hat and the imposing shape of a man. I was frozen in place. For what felt like an eternity, it didn't move. I kept telling myself it was just a shadow from outside, something ordinary that my mind was exaggerating in the dark. But just as I was about to turn away and face my sister, it moved. The shadow man was coming toward me. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide. But I was only 5 years old, and there was only one thing I knew how to do in that moment. I screamed. The moment I screamed, it vanished. I don't know where it went, it was just gone. The whole house woke up immediately. My grandparents and my sister rushed into the room, turning on the lights and looking around in confusion. That's when I realized something else that didn't make sense. It wasn't 9:30 p.m. like I had thought. It was 4 a.m. Exactly. After that, the same thing happened every time I stayed in that room. No matter what, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see him again. Eventually, I got older and stopped staying over as much. That's when my grandmother finally decided to shut the room down for good. Now I'm 16 years old, and I still see the shadow man, but only in my nightmares. Sometimes I wonder if it was real or just something my childhood mind created. But then there's something I can't explain. Every once in a while, everyone in my house wakes up at exactly 4 a.m., with no reason why. Whatever the shadow man is, I know one thing for sure. It isn't good. When I was around 15 or 16, something happened that I still can't explain. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but looking back now, it fills me with an uneasiness that's hard to shake. It wasn't just one night or a single strange event, it went on for months, and even now, years later, I still don't understand what happened. It all started suddenly, with no warning. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard loud crashing noises coming from the kitchen. It wasn't just a single sound, it was chaos. Glass shattering, metal clanking, plastic breaking apart. The noise was so intense, so loud, that I could feel it in my chest. It wasn't distant, wasn't muffled, it sounded like it was right there in my own house. I sat up immediately, my heart racing. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Maybe a thief had entered through the window, knocking things over in the dark. That thought sent a rush of panic through me. I ran to my parents' room, trying to stay calm but failing. I told them I had heard something in the kitchen, that it sounded like everything was being destroyed in there. They got up quickly, probably thinking I was overreacting, but they followed me as we went to check. When we turned on the kitchen light, nothing was out of place. Not a single thing. No broken plates, no glasses shattered on the floor, no overturned utensils. Everything was exactly as it had been before we went to bed. I stood there, staring at the clean, untouched kitchen, feeling completely confused. My parents sighed, shook their heads, and told me I must have dreamed it. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe I had been half asleep. I knew I hadn't been. And then, as soon as we turned off the light and left the kitchen, it started again. The same crashing, breaking, smashing sounds, echoing through the house. This time, I was frozen. It was impossible. We had just been there. We had just seen that everything was in its place. How was it happening again? I turned back to my parents, waiting for them to react, to look at me in horror and realize something was seriously wrong. But they didn't. They couldn't hear it. The sound that was so loud in my ears, the noise that was so clear and so real, they didn't hear any of it. That's when the fear started to set in. It happened again the next night. And the night after that. Every single night for months, I would hear the same thing. Loud, violent crashes coming from the kitchen. Plates breaking, glasses shattering, utensils clattering against the floor. And every single time, when I went to check, nothing had moved. At first, I tried to tell myself it had to be coming from outside. Maybe noisy neighbors messing around at night, maybe something from a distant apartment. But there was one big problem with that idea. We lived in an apartment building on the 3rd floor. The neighboring apartments on both sides were vacant at the time. Behind our building were slums, far away from us. In front, we only had a main road and a park. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Where could the sound be coming from? And more importantly, why did it sound like it was happening right inside my own kitchen? The fact that my parents couldn't hear it made it even worse. It wasn't just a strange noise in the night anymore. It was something only I could hear. And if I was the only one experiencing it, what did that mean? I started to lose sleep. Some nights, I forced myself to stay awake just to listen, to try and make sense of it. I would sit in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. And without fail, every night, it would start. Some nights, it lasted for 10 minutes. Other times, 15 or 20. But it was always the same sound, like someone was in the kitchen, breaking things on purpose. The worst part was the fear that came with it. It wasn't just the noise itself, it was the feeling. I could feel it. Like something wasn't right. Like something was watching me. It became a routine, hearing the sounds, feeling my stomach twist in knots, staying awake with my heart pounding until exhaustion took over. But after about 2 or 3 months, it just stopped. No more crashes. No more broken glass sounds. No more metal clanking against the floor. It was just over. At first, I didn't trust it. I waited, expecting it to start up again, but night after night, there was nothing. For a while, I let myself move on. It was a weird part of my life that I tried not to think about. Maybe it had been in my head. Maybe I had been too stressed, too tired. And then, it happened again. Just once. One single night, months later. A loud crash from the kitchen, exactly like before. I sat up in bed, my entire body frozen with fear. I didn't go check. I didn't even move. I just lay there, listening. It never happened again after that, but the fact that it returned, even for just one night, was enough to make my skin crawl. It felt like a reminder. Like something was still there, even if I couldn't hear it anymore. I'd never told anyone in my family about that last night. I didn't see the point. They never believed me before. Why would they believe me now? But I know what I heard. And I know it wasn't just my imagination. When I was younger, every summer and Christmas vacation, my cousins, my sister, and I would visit our aunt and uncle's home in Laguna. Their house was old, built decades ago, and stood in a subdivision that had its own share of eerie stories. Back then, we never thought much of it. We were just kids, more excited about playing outside, staying up late, and sneaking in ghost stories just for the thrill of it. One night, as we sat in a circle telling each other spooky tales, I decided to make up a story about a white lady haunting our home. I wanted to scare my cousins and make it sound as real as possible. We laughed and continued, each of us taking turns sharing made-up ghost stories. But then, Jay, one of my cousins, told us about a ghost that wasn't made up, a lady dressed in an old Spanish-style white camiseta, her long hair tied in a perfect bun, a high neck collar covering her throat. The chilling part? No one could see her face. At first, I thought Jay was just playing along, but as he continued, his tone was different, serious. He said this woman was well known among the homeowners. Many had seen her wandering near the clubhouse at night. Some saw her walking toward the playground, others claimed she stood near a large tree, her face hidden. Some said she simply roamed without direction, until she vanished into thin air. And the most terrifying accounts were from people who saw her inside their homes. That night, after my aunt told us to go to bed, I couldn't shake off the feeling that Jay's story was real. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I felt like someone was watching us from the shadows. The next morning, as we all gathered for breakfast, my uncle shared something that made our blood run cold. The previous night, after my aunt had put us to sleep, he heard strange noises coming from the living room. At first, he ignored it, thinking maybe the wind was blowing something outside, but the noises continued, like someone moving around. He got up to check and saw something that froze him in place. In the dim light coming from the front yard, he saw the silhouette of a woman sitting near the dining table. Because of his poor eyesight, he assumed it was my older cousin, Jan. He called out to her, telling her to go back to bed. She didn't respond. But he didn't think much of it, until the morning, when Jan came home. She had slept over at her best friend's house that night. She wasn't even home when my uncle saw the woman. The air in the room grew heavy as my uncle finished his story. Before we could fully digest what he had just said, another chilling revelation followed. A group of college students working on a thesis had been walking near the house late at night. They later admitted that they had seen a woman enter our house. They didn't recognize her, but when they heard my uncle's story, they refused to walk past that street again. But the encounters didn't stop there. One afternoon, my cousins and I were playing outside, being our usual mischievous selves. We had a habit of ringing doorbells and running away before the owners could answer. That day, my younger sister rang the doorbell of a big house at the end of the street. We all ran, except for her. She just stood there. We ran back to her, whispering urgently for her to hurry before someone saw us. But she didn't move. She looked at us and said, "We don't need to run. The owner already saw us." Confused, we asked what she meant. She explained that after pressing the doorbell, a woman from inside the house shouted at us. She heard her say, "Hoi! Tigelin yo na yen! Hey! Stop that!" Curious, my cousin Junior peeked through the gate. He saw a woman sitting inside the house, her face turned away, seemingly fixing her clothes. Feeling guilty, we decided to apologize. Just as we were about to leave, a car pulled up in front of the house. A family of 4 stepped out, the actual owners of the house. Junior casually told the teenage boy that a woman inside had scolded us. We assumed it was their aunt or an older cousin. But the boy's face turned pale. "What are you talking about? No one is inside. We all went to Barangas 2 days ago." We all froze. My cousin insisted that he saw someone inside the house, sitting right there in the living room. But the boy shook his head. "That's impossible." We left in silence, our excitement over the game completely gone. Who had been inside that house? Who was the woman that scolded us? Over time, the stories of this faceless woman in white spread throughout the subdivision. People whispered that even the community priest knew about her. He had performed rituals in several homes, including my aunt and uncle's house. Some people renovated their homes, hoping to drive her away. The more I heard, the more I wondered about her origins. There were different theories about who she was. One story said that during the Spanish era, a girl went missing. Her body was later found in a creek, the very spot where the clubhouse now stands. No one knew how she had died. Some said she was raped and murdered, her body abandoned in the water. Others believed she was a wealthy ilustrator, a woman from an elite Spanish family, who fell in love with an Indio, a local Filipino man. Her family never approved of the relationship, so she took her own life. Another version said she was betrayed by her lover, and in her grief, she ended it herself. No one knows the truth. Years have passed since then, and I haven't visited Laguna in a long time. I don't know if she still lingers in the shadows of that subdivision, appearing at doorways, watching from corners, or sitting in empty houses. But one thing is certain. She was real. The trip to Bangkok started as just another business visit. Thailand, with its deep-rooted beliefs in ghosts and spirituality, had never given me any personal reason to think twice about its supernatural lore. I had been to the country many times, staying in different hotels, never experiencing anything out of the ordinary. This time was no different, at least that's what I thought. I checked into my hotel at 3 p.m., a place I had stayed in a few times before without any incident. It was close to the customer's office, which made it convenient. Since I had a few hours before meeting my colleague for dinner at 5 p.m., I decided to take care of some ironing so that I wouldn't have to bother with it later in the week. The layout of my hotel room was fairly standard, except for one odd feature. The bathroom wall was made of glass. The only thing separating the sleeping area from the bathroom was the shower glass, making the sink and part of the bathroom clearly visible from the bed. Another unique detail was the sliding door that functioned as both the bathroom and closet door. If it was pushed to the right, the bathroom was shut, and the closet was open. Pushed to the left, the closet was closed, and the bathroom was open. I slid it to the right so I could use the closet while ironing. Everything seemed normal until I finished and wanted to freshen up before dinner. When I tried to slide the door to the left to enter the bathroom, it wouldn't move. It was completely stuck. At first, I assumed I had somehow accidentally locked it, but that didn't make sense. It was a sliding door, not the kind that locked so easily. Growing frustrated, I called the front desk, and within minutes, a repairman arrived. With a screwdriver, he managed to unlock the bathroom door from the outside. Problem solved, or so I thought. I freshened up and left for dinner without giving the incident another thought. Dinner went well, and by the time I returned to my hotel room around 11:30 p.m., I was tired but not exhausted. I had been drinking at dinner, not enough to be drunk, but enough that I wouldn't have gotten behind the wheel of a car. Still, I was fully functioning, aware of my surroundings, and completely in my right mind. After responding to a few emails, I got ready for bed. The nightstand next to the bed had a control box, something common in Asian hotels but rare in American ones. This small panel controlled all the room's lights and the air conditioning. Each light had its own button, allowing me to switch them off without having to get up. Once I was ready, I turned off all the lights using the control panel and lay down. Just as I was starting to settle in, thinking about my morning meeting, something unexpected happened. The bathroom light turned on by itself. I opened my eyes and turned my head toward the glass wall that separated the bathroom from the rest of the room. The light inside the bathroom was fully on, but there was nothing there. I sat up slightly, staring at it in confusion. My first thought was faulty wiring. That seemed like a logical explanation, so without thinking too much of it, I reached over and turned the bathroom light off again using the control panel. I lay back down, expecting that to be the end of it. 15 seconds later, the light turned back on. At the same time, I heard a scratching or clacking noise coming from inside the bathroom. It was faint but distinct, like something tapping on the glass or moving against a hard surface. Now I was wide awake. I turned my head again, my eyes fixed on the empty bathroom. My mind was racing, trying to find a reasonable explanation. Could there really be faulty wiring causing this? But then, what about the noise? I slowly reached over and turned the bathroom light off for the second time. I lay still, waiting. 15 seconds later, the same thing happened, the lights switched back on, and the scratching noise returned. At this point, my pulse had picked up. This wasn't normal. A faulty switch might cause flickering, but this was deliberate. It was as if something was turning the light back on every time I shut it off. I took a deep breath and turned it off again. This time, I waited longer. I counted 30 seconds, then 40, then a full minute. The lights stayed off. Just as I started to relax, a thought entered my mind: what if I tried to turn it on myself? I sat up and pressed the button for the bathroom light. Nothing happened. Confused, I pressed it again. Harder this time. The light wouldn't turn on. I tried a different button, one for the bedside lamp. Nothing. I tried the main room light. None of the lights in the room would turn on. The bathroom light had turned on by itself 3 times, but now that I wanted to turn it on, it wouldn't work. That's when the fear set in. I grabbed the phone and called the front desk. The woman who answered was polite but confused. She suggested that maybe my key card had been removed from the slot, cutting off the electricity. I assured her that my key card was still in place. She said she would send someone up immediately. Waiting in the dark was the worst part. I felt like something was there, watching me. I didn't sit on the bed. I moved to the desk in the farthest corner of the room, as far from the bathroom as possible. When the repairman knocked, I nearly jumped out of my skin. He checked the keycard slot first. Still in place. Then he moved to the control box and tried pressing the buttons himself. Nothing worked. The lights wouldn't turn on for him either. Finally, he decided to replace the entire control panel, convinced that was the issue. As he worked, I felt relieved. A faulty control box. That explained everything. But something still didn't sit right. I remembered the locked bathroom door from earlier that day. The sliding door that somehow locked itself while I was ironing. That wasn't electrical, that was mechanical. When the repairman finished and left, I hesitated before getting back in bed. Instead, I walked to the bathroom door, staring at the lock mechanism. Could it have really locked itself? I leaned in, inspecting the lock closely. I tried turning it, setting it in different positions, testing if there was a way it could have jammed shut. Then, at that exact moment, I heard the scratching noise behind me. The bathroom light turned off. I was plunged into darkness. I didn't think. I just grabbed my suitcase and called the front desk. I told them I wanted a new room immediately. No arguments, no explanations. I don't remember packing properly. I must have thrown everything into my bag in a rush. I left so fast that I forgot a stack of important expense receipts on the desk. Documents that would later cost me thousands in unreimbursed expenses. But at that moment, I didn't care. I just needed to get out of that room. People later told me it was faulty wiring. Maybe. Maybe it was. Maybe the door locked itself by coincidence. Maybe the control box malfunctioned at the worst possible moment. But all I know is that something didn't want me in that room that night. And I wasn't going to stay and find out why. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I was in high school in Canada when these events happened. At the time, I was 18 and not the type of person who liked going out much. Unlike other teenagers who found joy in hanging out with friends, I preferred the comfort of my room, watching dramas, anime, or playing video games. I only went outside if my friends insisted, and even then, they often had to bribe me with my favorite food to convince me. My parents worked all day, so after school, I would be home alone until late at night, sometimes even on weekends. One afternoon, I came home from school, as usual, knowing the house was empty. I began changing my clothes when I suddenly heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, moving towards my room. Thinking it was my dad coming home early, I instinctively shut my bedroom door and grabbed a bathrobe to cover myself. As I stepped out of my room, I casually called out, asking why he was home so early. But when I reached the living room and checked the entrance, there was no one there. On another day, I returned home and went about my usual routine of cleaning the house before retreating to my room. I was at the kitchen sink, washing dishes and absent-mindedly talking to myself about my day, something I often did when alone. The kitchen light was behind me, casting my shadow on the wall in front. While scrubbing a plate, I noticed something strange. Another shadow moved beside mine. My heart pounded as I turned my head quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the kitchen was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped washing, left the dishes as they were, and rushed to my room. I connected my laptop to my Bluetooth speaker and blasted music at full volume, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. Things didn't stop at home. One afternoon in school, I was in my 4th period class, sitting near the door, which was shut. The teacher had dimmed the lights, and we were watching a movie. Out of nowhere, the doorknob started rattling, as if someone was trying to open it. I glanced at my teacher, expecting him to get up and check, but he remained focused on the screen. The doorknob continued moving for nearly 20 seconds. No one else seemed to notice. A few minutes passed, and suddenly, the door began shaking violently. It was as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to break in. I turned back to my teacher and classmates, but everyone was still watching the movie, oblivious. A loud bang echoed through the room, as if something had been thrown against the door. Startled, I accidentally pushed back my chair, making a loud noise. My classmate beside me asked if I was okay. I forced a laugh, telling him I had dozed off. I didn't mention what had just happened. Curious and unnerved, I told my friends about my experiences. They joked that I had an unknown friend following me. One day, 4 of them came over after school to see if they could sense anything. We all stayed in my room, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed, and nothing did. They laughed, saying my so-called friend was too shy. When they left around 7 p.m., one of their parents came to pick them up. The next morning at school, they rushed toward me, looking panicked. They told me that as they were getting into the car the night before, their parent had asked where they had picked up the scent of sampaguita flowers. The smell had filled the car the moment they opened the door. But none of us had been carrying flowers. It was winter, no flowers were blooming, and we didn't have sampaguita at home. In the Philippines, there's a belief that if you smell sampaguita when there are none around, a spirit is nearby. That night, I called my grandmother in the Philippines and told her about everything that had been happening. She listened carefully, then told me to burn a white paper with salt, let the smoke fill the house, and pray. As we were talking, she suddenly asked if a child was near me. I told her no, I was alone. She said she could hear a child's laughter, loud and clear. My stomach clenched. I quickly ended the call, telling her I would speak to her later. Sitting on my bed, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I suddenly felt something warm on my left ear, like breath brushing against my hair. A shiver ran through me. I bolted out of my room and refused to go back in alone. That same night, I finally told my parents everything. My mom, clearly worried, placed 3 rosaries blessed with holy water in my room before we went to bed. The next day, I came home from school and went straight to my room, lying on my bed and thinking about all the strange things happening to me. I whispered under my breath that I didn't want to talk anymore, that I didn't like whatever it was that was following me. I went to the washroom, looked at myself in the mirror, and repeated it again. Then I walked to the kitchen, preparing to wash the dishes. Just as I was about to start, a tissue box suddenly fell from the top of a cabinet in front of me. I hesitated but picked it up and placed it back. As I turned to leave, the box fell again. My pulse raced. I turned on music again, hoping to drown out the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. That night, something terrifying happened. I was fast asleep when I suddenly woke up. 2 figures were standing at the foot of my bed. I could barely see their faces in the darkness, but I knew they were men. Before I could react, they were suddenly above me, pressing down on my hands and covering my mouth. My body was paralyzed. Their faces were featureless, just blank gray shapes. Even though they weren't holding my legs, I couldn't move them. I felt as though I was being pulled into my bed, as if a hole was opening beneath me. I tried screaming for my mother, but no sound came out. My chest felt heavy, my breath shallow. I struggled, fighting against the force pulling me down. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, 8 to 10 seconds of pure terror. Then, as suddenly as it began, they vanished. I gasped for air, heart pounding. I was drenched in sweat, and the room felt unbearably hot. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still standing behind me. My neck and ears burned. The sensation of someone breathing down my neck was so overwhelming that I refused to look back. I bolted from my room and ran straight to my parents' room, crying as I climbed into their bed. I refused to go back to my room for the rest of the night. After that, everything stopped. The strange occurrences, the noises, the eerie sensations, they were all gone. My life returned to normal. But I will never forget those nights, nor the feeling that, for a while, I was not alone in that house. I remember when my daughter was around 12 years old, she had just bought a new CD and left it on her bed. Later that day, she came to me, upset, saying it had disappeared. I assumed it must have fallen behind or slipped down the side, so I went with her to look for it. As I checked around, she kept insisting that it couldn't have fallen. It had been placed right in the middle of the bed. To ease her frustration, I knelt down to look underneath, still convinced it must have slipped somewhere. Half-jokingly, I said out loud, "Okay, whoever took it, put it back, please," and I laughed. Just as I finished speaking, a small ornamental doll, one that had been sitting untouched on a shelf for years, fell off and hit me on the head. The shelf was about 3 feet away, and the doll shouldn't have landed on me. If it had simply tipped over, it should have fallen straight to the floor, but instead, it came right at me. My daughter and I looked at each other, startled by what had just happened. Before we could process it, a loud bang echoed from another bedroom. We ran to check, but there was nothing out of place. No explanation. We were both unsettled but brushed it off. Over time, little things continued to happen, but nothing extreme enough for me to take too seriously. Then, one Christmas, my daughter received a small laptop as a gift. After dinner, she went to her bedroom to get it, only to find that the screen was smashed from the inside. No one had been upstairs, and the laptop had been perfectly fine just hours earlier. I didn't want to scare her, so I told her it must have been faulty, though in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was happening. One morning, I went to her room to make her bed. Just as I stepped inside, a pair of her glasses flew off the shelf, past me, and landed about 3 or 4 feet away. If they had simply fallen, they should have landed directly below on the table, but instead, they were thrown with force. That moment genuinely frightened me. Something unseen had deliberately moved them. At one point, I asked my daughter if she had experienced anything else that she hadn't told me. She hesitated, then admitted she had seen a blue light shoot across the kitchen one night, in the dark. She also told me she frequently saw small shadows moving. I was shocked. I had noticed the odd occurrence here and there, but I had no idea she had been seeing things so often. Then came Halloween night, when everything escalated. We had been listening to ghost stories on the radio, and watching scary programs on TV. It was past 1 in the morning when we all finally went to bed. A little while later, I heard my daughter scream from her room. I called out, and she quickly responded, "It's okay." But seconds later, she ran into my room, terrified and half-dressed, shaking as she told me what had happened. She had placed a hairband on her bed before getting ready to sleep, but as she watched, it started moving on its own. She saw it shift 2 or 3 times. I tried to calm her down, telling her it must have been static electricity, especially since we had been listening to ghost stories all night. But she was adamant, it hadn't just twitched, it had clearly moved. To reassure her, I walked into her room and looked at the hairband. Just as I stood there, it happened again. Right in front of me, the hairband moved. It wasn't a subtle shift, it moved twice, in a deliberate, controlled way. I was completely stunned. My heart pounded, and for the first time, I felt genuinely afraid. That was the first time my daughter had ever seemed truly scared by the strange happenings in our home. She had always been able to shrug off the other incidents, but this had shaken her. That night she slept in our room. The next day, she went back to her own room, but after that, she would sometimes glance at me while we were in the house, her eyes flickering towards something I couldn't see. She wouldn't say anything, but I knew she had spotted another shadow. For 2 or 3 years, these strange occurrences continued. Things would move inexplicably, objects would vanish and reappear, and my daughter kept seeing those small, darting shadows. Then, without any warning, it all just stopped. It has been 10 years now, and as far as I know, nothing strange has happened since. The house was only 4 years old at the time, surrounded by other homes, so there was no eerie history attached to it. I still don't understand what was happening in those years, and I may never have an explanation. But to this day, I remember every moment vividly, especially the way that hairband moved, twice, right before my eyes. This all started when I was in 10th grade. We were living in a rental house, and as it always happens, we had to move once our lease was up. My parents began searching for a new place, and one day, my mother came across a house that she was instantly drawn to. She felt an unexplainable connection to it, and my father, trusting her instincts, agreed to take it. We moved in shortly after. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon, strange things started happening. I have a habit of studying out loud, almost like reciting my lessons, and I started noticing something unsettling. I could feel someone behind me, as if they were softly repeating my words. It wasn't an echo, it felt like a presence. When I told my mother, she brushed it off, saying it was just because the house was new to us. I tried to believe that, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. The layout of the house was unusual. It was triangular in shape, with 2 adjacent rooms and a hall in front of them. Between the hall and the rooms, there was an open space where we placed our refrigerator. Beyond that, there was a 3rd room, and it was in this room that something felt deeply wrong. Often, I would sense something moving from that room to the space near the refrigerator, always stopping short of the small temple we had set up in the hall. It was as if the presence lurking there had an invisible boundary it couldn't cross. That room had an oppressive atmosphere, especially when I tried to study there. It was as if the air itself was heavy, pressing down on me. It drained my energy, and during my midterm exams, I became seriously ill. My parents also began facing health issues, and my father suffered unexpected financial losses. Despite all this, they refused to consider that something paranormal might be at play. Things continued to happen, but one particular incident made everything even more terrifying. One night, I had a dream, but it felt more like a warning than just a dream. I saw a woman from behind. Her ears were burnt, she wore a white sari, and her long hair hung down her back. A voice, or maybe just a feeling, told me that if the small temple in the hall was ever displaced, one of my family members would die. The dream shook me so much that I told my mother about it the next morning, but she dismissed it, saying I was just imagining things from watching too many horror movies. The irony was, ever since we had moved into that house, I had completely lost interest in horror movies. I didn't know why, but I just couldn't bring myself to watch anything like that anymore. Then, something happened that finally made my father believe that something unnatural was in that house. One night, I was studying in the hall while my parents were in their bedroom. Out of nowhere, my father saw a shadow pass across my mother's face. It wasn't the play of light or a trick of the eye. He was certain he had seen something. That night, he was so disturbed that we decided to start looking for another house immediately. Unfortunately, we couldn't find one right away, and before we could finalize anything, our landlord suddenly came to us, furious, and demanded that we vacate the house within 5 to 6 days. The timing was terrible. I was in the middle of my board exams. We pleaded with him to give us more time, but he wouldn't budge. We had no choice but to scramble for a new place as fast as possible. After much searching, we finally found a house. Initially, we planned to move in a couple of days after my next exam, but something felt off that evening. My father, in particular, became extremely restless. He was so uneasy that he insisted we move that very night. I didn't understand why, but his anxiety was so intense that we packed up everything and left immediately. The next morning, my father went back to return the keys to the owner. That's when he learned something that left him completely shaken. The landlord had died earlier that morning. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. I remembered my dream, the warning about the temple being moved. If we hadn't left when we did, who knows what could have happened to us? We never looked back. Even now, I can't help but wonder, was it the house that forced us out? Or was it something else entirely that had been waiting for its moment? It all started when I moved into a small room, barely enough for me to live comfortably. I even had to use a common toilet. After about 3 weeks of attending classes and making some friends, we decided to move into a villa together. There were 7 of us, 2 from Nepal, 2 from the Philippines, 1 from India, 1 from Sri Lanka, and myself. The villa was a newly built 2-story house in Matar Kadim, a quiet residential area with nearby shops and malls. What was common in these houses was the rooftop, open and usually decorated with chairs and tables, perfect for sitting in the evenings and relaxing. That became our routine. We'd come home after lectures, grab some energy drinks, smoke cigarettes, and sit on the rooftop, chatting and unwinding. Behind our villa, there was a wide road, big enough for 4 vehicles. On the left side of the road, a vast empty land was under construction, surrounded by a tall wall that blocked the view from the street. However, from our rooftop, we could see inside: construction vehicles, workers, piles of dirt, and scattered materials. It was just a regular sight, nothing unusual. One evening, around 6:15 p.m., we were up on the rooftop, as usual, smoking and chatting about movies, when something seemed off. We all noticed it at the same time. The construction site was gone. The wall was missing, the vehicles had disappeared, and the entire land had transformed. The sun had almost set, leaving only dim light from the street lamps, but what we could see made no sense. Instead of construction work, the land was now covered in dry, lifeless trees, tall, barren, with twisted branches reaching into the darkening sky. There weren't many, maybe 3 or 4, but they stood there ominously. Among the trees, we could see what looked like gravestones, old and weathered, with Arabic inscriptions carved into the stone. The entire place felt unsettling, like something out of a horror movie. We started making up theories. Maybe the owner had abandoned the project, or maybe the government had taken over. But how could such a drastic change happen overnight? We had walked past that place just that morning, and everything had been normal. Our curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to check it out. As we got closer, the eerie silence of the place sank into us. The street lamps on the right side of the road barely cast any light, making it even harder to see. We stepped onto the land, moving cautiously past the gravestones. The deeper we went, the heavier the air felt. Then, suddenly, we heard a voice. A man was shouting in Arabic, his tone sharp and angry. We turned to see him standing at the edge of the graveyard, waving his arms, clearly telling us to leave. He was tall and slim, with dark skin, dressed in a long brown robe with a headscarf wrapped tightly around his head. A second scarf draped over his shoulders, swaying in the wind. In his hand, he held a long wooden stick. We tried asking him questions. What had happened to the construction? Why was there a graveyard here? But he ignored us, continuing to shout and motion for us to leave. One of my friends suggested we ignore him and explore further, but the moment we moved, the man charged at us with his stick raised. Without hesitation, we ran. We sprinted toward the far end of the land, dodging gravestones and bushes, desperate to get away. As I ran, I turned back to see if he was chasing us. He wasn't. He had stopped right at the edge of the graveyard, standing motionless, still gripping his stick. His face was blurry, indistinct, as though it was shrouded in shadow. Breathless, we reached the other side, where the land turned back into a dusty construction zone. At that point, we convinced ourselves that he was just a guard, maybe hired to protect the site for some movie production. Qatar had recently been a filming location for Transformers, so we thought maybe this was another set. Laughing nervously, we walked home, trying to shake off the unease. That night, we sat on the rooftop again, drinking Red Bull and smoking, pretending everything was normal. I took a shower and went to bed, exhausted. But the next morning, I woke up to chaos. My housemates were shouting, running between the ground floor and the rooftop. Confused, I rushed upstairs. What I saw made my stomach drop. The construction site was back. The wall was there again, the vehicles had returned, and the land was just as it had been before. There was no trace of a graveyard, no trees, no tombstones. I ran downstairs, where the others were gathered around a phone, watching a video. One of the guys, from the Philippines, had accidentally recorded everything while trying to turn on his flashlight. We all crowded around, desperate to see what had happened. The video showed us walking into the site, but what we saw on the screen wasn't a graveyard. It was a normal construction site. The footage captured us running, but instead of dodging gravestones, we were leaping over piles of dirt and construction pits. The video was grainy, taken in low light on an old Sony Ericsson P990, but it was clear enough to contradict everything we had seen. The place we ran through last night was not the same place recorded on the phone. That entire day, we couldn't stop staring at the site, trying to make sense of it. But the more we thought about it, the less it made sense. The next morning, while waiting for our van to the university, we started discussing the incident again. Our driver, Mr. Sadiq, a calm and well-spoken Sudanese man, overheard our conversation and decided to chime in. He looked at us and said, "That land, it used to be a graveyard. A very old one. Long before any of these buildings were here." We all froze. He continued, "They say the graves were moved, but who knows if the spirits moved with them? People have talked about strange things happening there for years." Chills ran down my spine. We had walked into something we weren't meant to see. A place that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. But for those few minutes it had. I used to visit my grandparents every summer with my parents when I was a little kid. I always wanted to be independent, and it made me feel like a grown-up when I got to do things on my own. So, one summer, my parents decided to leave me alone with my grandparents for a week. It was a big deal for me since they were always around wherever I went. My grandparents lived in a large 3-story mansion. The first floor had only one room, and the second floor was just an open terrace. While I was excited about my newfound freedom, the house was often too quiet. Every little sound was noticeable, no matter how faint. It didn't take long before I started hearing footsteps from the first floor room. Sometimes I even heard them coming from the room I was staying in, which used to be my mom's. At first I ignored it, thinking it was just my imagination. But eventually I asked my grandmother if she ever heard the footsteps. She just shook her head. Then she asked, "Did your mother ever tell you the story of the footsteps?" That was strange because my mom had never mentioned anything like that before. I didn't say anything, but my grandmother continued. "She always used to complain about someone else in the house, but I have never seen or heard anything." I didn't know what to make of that, so I just let it go. 2 nights later, I was sleeping in my mom's old bedroom when I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was lying in bed, unable to move. A tall, dark figure stood over me, watching. It had no eyes, no clear features, but its head was tilted in my direction. It just stood there for a long time, staring. Then, suddenly, it reached out and grabbed my wrist. The fear jolted me awake. My heart was pounding, and I was covered in sweat, even though the air conditioning was on. I instinctively reached for the light switch, but the moment I moved my hand, a sharp pain shot through my wrist. It felt like someone had tightly squeezed it, pulling all the muscles along the circumference of my arm. Gasping, I looked down at my wrist. A deep red mark circled around it, as if something had gripped me with immense force. I didn't even bother turning off the lights. I jumped out of bed and ran straight to my grandmother's room, crawling into her bed without saying a word. The next morning, the mark was gone. My wrist felt perfectly fine. I didn't tell my grandparents what had happened, but after that night, I made sure I was never alone in that house. I spent the rest of the week sticking close to them, and nothing else happened. When I returned home, I told my mom about it. She wasn't surprised. She told me that whatever it was, it only bothered people who paid attention to it. According to her, I wasn't used to so much silence, and that's how it got to me. She explained that the key to avoiding the haunting was to keep my mind busy. The more occupied my thoughts were, the easier it was to tune it out. That's why my grandparents never heard it, and why I didn't experience anything else after that night. I was constantly thinking about keeping someone close to me. Since then, whenever I visited my grandparents, I made sure to keep myself busy. They still live in the same house, but I never experienced anything like that again. This happened when I was in college studying nursing, back in 2007 or 2008. It was my third year in the course, and I was staying in the Philippines at the time. The experience took place during our psychiatric affiliation at Vicente Sotto Memorial Hospital in Cebu City. I wasn't familiar with the area since I wasn't from Cebu, but we stayed in a dormitory near the hospital and the psych wards. I never knew much about the history of the place, but I always wondered if others had experienced strange things there. If I could find out for sure, maybe it would give me some peace of mind because what happened during our stay was something I could never forget. When we arrived, it was already dusk, and night was approaching fast. As soon as I stepped into the dormitory, I felt an overwhelming sense of darkness. Even though the lights were on, the place still seemed dim in a way that had nothing to do with the brightness of the bulbs. The entire structure was circular, with a staircase leading up to the second-floor rooms. Large columns supported the building, and if you were to draw lines between them, they almost formed a pentagram. Maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me, but the way the dormitory was built gave off an eerie feeling that was hard to shake. The sleeping arrangements were straightforward. The boys and girls were separated into different rooms, each large enough to fit around 10 people. Double-decker beds were lined up in neat rows, almost like a military barracks. Our room had a small balcony at the back, a space meant for laundry, but when I stepped out there alone, I instantly felt uneasy. The balcony overlooked a massive acacia tree, and as soon as I saw it, I felt an unshakable feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Goosebumps covered my skin. I immediately stepped back inside, making a mental note never to go out there alone again. Strange things started happening within the first few days. I had already sensed that something was off, but I didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't want to be the one to start spreading fear. But soon, everyone had their own eerie experiences, and no one could ignore what was happening. One of my classmates lost her phone. She was sure she had left it on her bed, but when she went to get it, it was gone. At first, we assumed someone must have taken it. To be sure, we called her number, and after a few rings, someone answered. My classmate spoke hesitantly, expecting to hear a familiar voice, but instead, an old woman responded. We could all see the confusion and fear on her face as she listened. She asked the woman where she had found her phone, but the response made her go pale. The woman, speaking in Bisaya, kept saying how beautiful she was and how much she liked her hair. My classmate was so disturbed by the call that she hung up immediately. She was shaking, her face drained of color. When we asked her what had happened, she explained what the woman had said. What scared her the most was that it sounded like the woman knew her, as if she had been watching her closely. We tried to brush it off as a prank caller, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right. A moment later, she decided to go back to her room. As soon as she entered, she screamed. Her phone was right there on her bed, the exact spot where she had left it in the first place. There was another vacant room in the dormitory, filled with empty double-decker beds. Since no one was using it, a group of us decided to hang out there instead of crowding in the hallway. Everything was fine at first. The girls were chatting and gossiping while I lay on one of the empty beds, scrolling through my phone. Then suddenly, a commotion broke out on the other side of the room. The girls were screaming, running toward the door in a panic. I bolted upright as they rushed past me, completely terrified. Outside, they struggled to catch their breath as they explained what had happened. One of them had been recording their conversation on her phone for fun. While playing it back, they heard something that hadn't been there before. At first, it was a faint noise in the background. Then, as the recording continued, it became clearer, a girl's voice singing in Bisaya. The song was unfamiliar, almost like an old folk tune. There had been no one else in the room besides us, and yet, there was no mistaking the voice. One of the girls was so freaked out that she threw her phone across the room as if it was cursed. The scariest experience happened one night, while we were all asleep. I was on the top bunk, the lights dimmed, everyone silent. But as I lay there, I suddenly felt a cold, creeping sensation, like something unseen was watching me from the darkness. I was facing the back of the room, toward the balcony door, the same one that led to the acacia tree outside. The sensation of dread grew stronger, and my skin prickled with unease. Then, out of the shadows, I saw it. At first, it was just a vague shape, but soon, the form became clear, a woman with long, tangled hair, her face obscured but with burning red eyes. She stood motionless, scanning the room as if searching for something. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct in my body told me to stay still, not to move a muscle. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was no longer at the far end of the room. She was right in front of me. Terror gripped me. My body refused to move. The figure hovered inches from my face, her malevolent gaze piercing through me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Somehow, through my fear, I managed to reach for the cross necklace I wore around my neck. Clutching it tightly, I forced the words out of my mouth. "In the name of Jesus Christ, leave us alone. We have done nothing to you." And just like that, she was gone. The next morning, a classmate asked me why I had been talking to myself during the night. I simply shook my head, not wanting to tell them what I had seen. They had already experienced enough. To this day, I don't know what that place was, or why it had such a heavy, unsettling energy. I never asked the locals, and I never returned. But I do know one thing: whatever was there wasn't just in our imagination. We all saw, heard, and felt it. And it wasn't something I will ever forget. Before this experience, I always tried to rationalize things. Even though I was open-minded about the supernatural, I assumed that if anything happened, it was probably just my mind wanting to connect things to lost loved ones. I always had an attitude of, "Okay, that's interesting, but we'll never really know if it's supernatural." That changed when I went for a walk at a Civil War battlefield near my home and realized that it was, in fact, real. I prefer not to name the battlefield, and there's a reason for that. There isn't much information online about it being haunted, and I think that's a good thing. It's hallowed ground, a place where soldiers gave their lives, and I wouldn't want it to attract people looking to stir things up, perform rituals, or disrespect the history of the site. What I experienced there made me look at it differently, and I'll recount everything in order. Some details may seem unimportant, but maybe someone will catch something I missed. The battlefield is a national park with miles of trails, shaded dirt paths perfect for running. But for some reason, even though I used to run a lot, I never felt comfortable doing so there. One time, maybe 10 years ago, I was walking with some neighbors when I suddenly got a deep, unsettling feeling. It was pure anxiety, a flight reflex, in broad daylight. I told my friends to run, though they thought I was just talking about exercise. I never told them that I had never felt anything like that before. The park has a visitor center and main parking areas, but in a more secluded part, there's a monument paid for by the people of Illinois to honor the soldiers who died there in 1864. About 15 years ago, I took my then boyfriend to see it. He was military and from out west, so I thought he'd appreciate the history. After parking, We walked down a path flanked by earthen battlements, positions for Confederate cannons. The path led to a steep hill, about the length of a football field and a half, where the tall monument stood. As we walked, the air felt unnaturally heavy, more humid than usual, and the woods around us went eerily silent. We noticed a group of deer standing at the tree line, staring at us in a way I can't explain. Neither of us said anything, but later, we both admitted we had felt something strange. Years later, about 3 years ago, I went back with my preteen son on a day off from school. It was a Tuesday, around 2 p.m., and we approached from the direction the Union Army would have taken before the battle. The path went downhill toward a creek at the tree line, where Union soldiers would have gathered before advancing. I had a new iPhone and took pictures of my son on a small bridge. On a whim, I turned on the voice recorder as we walked up the battlefield hill. Maybe it was because I had been hearing faint yells at regular intervals, every 2 minutes or so, but I had assumed they were just kids playing in the woods. Something in me must have wanted to capture the sounds, even though I had never tried recording EVPs before. I didn't want my son to see what I was doing, so I held my phone casually. Halfway up the hill, I asked my son if he heard the yells. He said he did. He climbed onto a tree stump while I huffed my way up. At the top, we took more pictures at the monument, then headed home, only passing one older couple on the trail. Later, I listened to the recording. The yells were clear, both my husband and I could hear them. But there was something else. My husband, who is military, pointed out a distant sound with a specific cadence. "That sounds like artillery fire," he said. We hadn't heard it in person. Then, when we turned up the volume, we realized we had captured an EVP. At the bottom of the hill, a male voice said, "There's something here I don't trust," followed by a faint female laugh. When I asked my son if he heard the yells, another deep voice said, "Here." Before my son could answer, a young boy's voice, close to the microphone, whispered, "Them soldiers is dead." A moment later, the same boy's voice asked, "What's that?" Right at the moment I had held out my phone. That line, "Them soldiers is dead," stood out to me. I'm meticulous about grammar. If I had been faking something, I would have never worded it like that. The boy's voice was younger than my son's and much closer to me. Months later, when the kids were away at camp, my husband and I went out to dinner near the battlefield and decided to stop by around dusk. This time, there were more people at the monument. As I sat on a bench at the top of the hill, I felt something lightly touch my hair. I instinctively reached up to sweat at it, thinking it was a bug, but there was nothing there. Only later did I realize it wasn't the feeling of a bug, it felt like my hair being flipped. We walked down to the tree line, and my husband suddenly mentioned a strong, familiar smell. "It smells like wet canvas, like old military tents," he said. Then he hesitated. "You never forget that smell." I looked around and asked, "Well, do you see any wet canvas in these woods?" Of course, there was nothing. He walked ahead of me back up the hill. I lingered at the bottom, trying to sense something, but everything felt normal. I started walking up and suddenly became overwhelmingly winded. By the time I reached the top, where most of the soldiers had died, I could barely catch my breath. I had to lean on a fence to steady myself. I thought to myself, "Wow, am I getting that out of shape?" Weeks later, I returned with my son for a school project, and I walked up the hill easily, without any strain. That's when I realized it hadn't been exhaustion that day. It was something else. A glimpse, maybe, into the fear, the panic, and the desperation those soldiers felt as they ran up that hill to their deaths. I drive by the battlefield often, but I haven't gone back for a long time. I still feel drawn to it, and I know countless people visit every day, paying tribute. But there's something about that place, something still lingering, something watching, listening, and I'm not sure I'm ready to experience it again. When I was about 5 years old, my family moved to the rural town of Wimauma, Florida. The place was isolated, surrounded by pools of water from an old fish farm, and far removed from the main road. It was in that house, a small, two-bedroom trailer, that I had some of the most unsettling experiences of my life. The trailer had no air conditioning, so we had to keep the windows open for ventilation. Doors were often left ajar to help air circulate, and fans were constantly running, doing their best to move the heavy, humid air. My parents assured me that I would get used to the place, but from the very first night, I knew something was off. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear noises, strange sounds from both inside and outside my room. My parents told me it was just nerves from the move, but that explanation didn't sit right with me. The noises weren't normal, and what disturbed me even more were the shadows. The trailer sat deep in the property, far from the old country road. The only significant source of light was a single street lamp my dad called a silent giant, perched high atop a telephone pole. Its glow covered part of the yard, but beyond that, the landscape faded into darkness. No car headlights could have reached my room unless a vehicle had been driving directly toward us, which never happened. I might have been able to ignore the noises, convincing myself they were just animals, frogs, raccoons, stray cats, even alligators, which weren't uncommon in the area. But the shadows? They were different. They weren't just tricks of the light or figments of my imagination. They had form. They had shape. And some of them moved. That first night, as I lay in bed, I heard something outside my window. I looked out, expecting to see an animal rustling in the grass, but there was nothing. When I turned back toward my room, I noticed something standing in the doorway. A dark figure, completely motionless, watching me. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I was frozen. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved on, replaced by another. And another. A procession of dark shapes, each pausing in my doorway just long enough to turn its head toward me before moving along. They passed as if walking a predetermined route through the house, acknowledging my presence but otherwise ignoring me. That was the only time it happened in quite that way, but it wasn't the end of the encounters. Over the weeks that followed, I continued to see them, dark, featureless shapes standing in the hallway, peering at me from doorways. They weren't always alone. Sometimes I would feel a presence standing at the foot of my bed, watching silently as I struggled to keep my eyes shut. Then, there was the one that was different from the rest. Unlike the shifting figures that came and went, this one appeared repeatedly. It was taller than the others, with a solid, humanoid outline. It wasn't transparent, but it wasn't entirely solid either. The only thing distinguishable about it was its eyes, two deep, empty sockets that somehow radiated a piercing gaze. I couldn't see through it, but it could see through me. One night, I got up to use the bathroom. As I stepped into the hallway, I stopped. Something was there. It wasn't like the figures I had seen before, which moved with purpose and then disappeared. This was different. It had no distinct form, just a heavy, impenetrable darkness that blocked my path. It was shapeless, but I could feel it watching me. My chest tightened with fear, and without thinking, I turned and ran back to my bed, diving under the covers, willing myself not to move, not to breathe too loudly. Beyond the shadows, other strange things happened in that house. The television would turn on by itself, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes when no one was home. My parents always had a rational explanation, but I knew better. That house had something in it, something that didn't want to leave. We lived there for over 6 years, and while the experiences weren't constant, they never truly stopped. Then, one day, a fire swept through the area. Our trailer was completely destroyed. We lost nearly everything. It forced us to move to Tampa, and while the fire was devastating, in some ways, I felt relief. It was as if something had finally been erased, as if whatever was in that house had been taken with it. Looking back, I don't know what I experienced. Maybe the land itself held something dark, something old. Maybe whatever was there had been watching long before we arrived. But one thing I do know, I never saw those shadows again after we left. And for that, I was grateful. During the last week of October 2019, my husband Rex and I took a road trip down the south coast of New South Wales. It was a 9-day journey, and on our way back to Sydney, we made our last stop in a small, picturesque coastal town within the Kiama hinterland. From the moment we arrived, something felt off. As we drove up the hill toward a large timber-framed house, a strong urge washed over me. I wanted Rex to keep driving until we got home. The place looked beautiful, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun, well-maintained and inviting. But I felt unwelcome. Rex was surprised by my reaction. I had no complaints about any of the previous places we stayed. But he was exhausted from the drive, so we decided to stay the night and give the place a chance. The guest cottage, a 2-bedroom structure with a rustic design, sat at the bottom of a steep gravel driveway, surrounded by lush cabbage tree palms. The wooden veranda stretched across the entire front, offering a view of the valley below, where black and white Friesian cows grazed. Each suite had its own entrance, accessible through sliding glass doors that led to the porch. The main wooden door, adorned with antique leaded glass, opened into the shared living room between the suites. While Rex carried our bags inside, I took our cooler bag to the fridge. As I passed through the living room, something outside the window caught my eye, a flash of white moving quickly from left to right. I looked up and saw the figure of a woman in a white dress, her dark hair short and neatly styled. At first I thought it was my own reflection, but the figure was slimmer than me, and the hairstyle was different. The only other person on the property, Mary, the woman who ran the place, had shoulder-length hair and had been wearing a black and white blouse with light-colored pants when we met her 10 minutes ago. I stood there for a moment, staring as the woman disappeared from view. The oddest part was that there was nowhere for her to go. The direction she was walking didn't lead to the main house, it led to nothing. And considering how loudly the wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, it was strange that she had passed by in complete silence. Curious, I went to the kitchen window to see if she would reappear around the back of the cottage. No one was there. Instead, I was hit with a terrible smell, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, and damp mold. It was coming from the kitchen sink. Assuming there was a blockage, I boiled some water and poured it down the drain, but the stench lingered. Yet, when we first arrived and Mary showed us around, the air had been perfectly fine. Then there was the bottle in the fridge. Mary had assured us there was fresh drinking water for us, but when I opened the fridge door, I found a red frosted bottle that was nearly empty. Thirsty, I took a sip, but immediately spat it out. The water had a strange taste, not exactly stale, but herbal, almost like jasmine tea. When I poured it down the sink, I noticed it had a faint greenish tint. Maybe the previous guests had left it behind? As I walked through the kitchen, I kept feeling like the floor was sticky beneath my feet. But when I finally checked, my soles were completely clean. The tiles weren't sticky at all. It was just an odd sensation, like the floor had an invisible layer of filth that I could feel but not see. That night, before turning off the lights, I checked around the bedroom. In the far corner, where there was a spare bunk bed and a small alcove, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting away. It wasn't menacing, but it left me with an uneasy feeling, as if I had been warned to be on guard. I said a prayer before going to bed, asking for protection and peace. At almost midnight, Rex and I were startled awake by a sharp crackling sound. It came from the small window above the bed. The glass crackled loudly, twice. Yet the large sliding glass doors remained still. The weather had been mild that day, and the temperature didn't drop significantly until early morning. But when it did get colder around 4 a.m., the window made no further sounds. The next night, the same thing happened, at nearly the exact same time. Oddly enough, I didn't feel afraid when it happened. If anything, I felt reassured. As if something, or someone, was tapping the window, chasing something else away. I found myself thinking about the prayer I had said before bed. Was it being answered? The next morning, the kitchen smelled normal again. I decided not to mention anything about the night before. At breakfast, we ate in the main house, which felt much cleaner, lighter. Mary's husband, Anton, joined us and told us about the property. He had built the house and the guest cottage nearly 30 years ago on what had once been an empty stretch of land. For over 20 years, they had run the place as a bed and breakfast. The house stood on high ground, while the guest cottage sat lower on the hill, sloping toward the valley. He mentioned that, long ago, the entire area had been a rainforest that led into swampy land. Wet, damp, thick with vegetation. I immediately thought of the moldy stench from the sink. At breakfast on our last day, I asked Anton if neighbors ever used the property as a shortcut, or if Mary had returned to the cottage for some reason. He was adamant that no one was allowed on their land. Mary had gone to play croquet right after she left the cottage, and she didn't own any white dresses. Could the figure I saw have been Mary in her croquet uniform? It seemed unlikely. Besides, she would have had to change clothes, make the 5-minute trek down the hill, walk past Rex, who was unloading our bags, and somehow move across the veranda without making a sound. And yet, Anton insisted it must have been her. His tone became sharp, almost defensive. I decided not to press further. On the morning we left, everything felt normal. The air was fresh, the kitchen smelled fine, and the uneasy feeling was gone. Maybe the strange occurrences had been naturally explainable after all. Or maybe pouring hot water down the sink and saying a prayer had cleansed whatever was there. I don't know what I sensed during those 2 nights, but I do know one thing: we won't be going back. I've been working at a call center in BGC for 10 years now. When I first joined, the building was impressive: modern facilities, spacious workspaces, and comfortable amenities. One of the best perks was the sleeping quarters on every floor, where employees could take a quick nap during breaks. Back then, the company was still growing, and there weren't many employees on each floor, which meant the sleep rooms were often empty. But my experience in the 18th floor sleep room still haunts me to this day. It was around 3 a.m., and my shift had just ended. I planned to go home, but given the frequent reports of hold-ups and snatchings in the area, I decided to wait until sunrise. Since the office was nearly empty, I went to the sleeping quarters to rest. The room had 7 bunk beds, and I chose the middle one because there was a nearby socket where I could charge my phone. As I lay down and closed my eyes, I suddenly saw something, a blur, rushing past me on my left side. Startled, I sat up and looked around. No one was there. I shook it off, assuming it was just my imagination, and tried to sleep again. But then, it happened again. This time, the blur moved quickly past my right side. I opened my eyes immediately. Again, nothing. A creeping fear settled in my chest. Still, I reminded myself of what people always say: be more afraid of the living than the dead. Trying to calm myself, I turned on all the lights in the room and eventually fell asleep. Not long after, my alarm went off. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My eyes were half open, and I could see 2 janitors entering the room to check if it was clean. I struggled to call out to them, desperately trying to move my body, but no sound came from my mouth. I kept shouting in my mind, "Help! Help! I'm here!" But they couldn't hear me. They left the room, switched off the lights, and closed the door. Then, from the corner of my vision, I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed, right next to my feet, was the blurred figure. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. The image slowly became clearer: a man wearing a barong and black slacks. His feet didn't touch the ground. He was floating 3 inches above the floor. His face, however, was unsettling. The left side was severely distorted, unrecognizable, almost crushed. But the right side, though intact, was covered in tears. He was sobbing, his shoulders shaking up and down, yet I couldn't hear a single sound. I panicked. My body was frozen in place, and I could feel a weight pressing down on me. My heart pounded as I forced myself to pray. I recited every prayer I could remember, my voice trembling in my mind. Slowly, the figure began to fade. The moment it disappeared completely, my body was released from its paralysis. I bolted out of bed and ran out of the sleeping quarters, swearing never to sleep alone in that room again. Later that day, I asked some of my colleagues, those who had been with the company longer, if there were any ghost stories about the building. They exchanged uneasy glances before finally telling me about an accident that happened 2 months after the building was first occupied. An agent had fallen to his death from the 18th floor. They said that one night, the elevator doors opened, but there was no elevator car. The agent, distracted by his phone while texting, didn't notice and stepped forward, plummeting down the shaft. When his body was recovered, his face was completely disfigured, his skull shattered, and his left eye had popped out from the impact. The sight was so gruesome that some employees who had witnessed it resigned out of fear that something similar might happen to them. Chills ran down my spine. I told them about what had happened to me in the sleep room, and everyone fell silent. Some looked terrified, others muttered prayers under their breath. Maybe that man's spirit still roamed the building, lost, trying to reach out. Maybe he wanted to say something to be heard. Since then, I have always prayed for his soul, hoping he finds peace. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Last spring, I went on a road trip to Deadwood, South Dakota, with my best friend and his girlfriend. On the way there, we passed through Badlands National Park, one of the most breathtaking places I had ever seen. The landscape was unlike anything else, vast, rugged, and almost otherworldly. We spent about 3 hours exploring, taking pictures, and just soaking in the scenery before deciding to continue our journey to Deadwood. Just before leaving the park, I noticed an overlook that seemed perfect for one last photo. My friend pulled over, and we all got out to take in the view. It was freezing that day, and after a few minutes, my friend and his girlfriend decided to head back to the car to warm up. I lingered for a moment, wanting to take in the vast prairie one last time before we left. As I turned to leave, my eyes fell on a rock that stood out among the others. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a simple rock, but I felt an intense, almost irresistible urge to take it with me. I picked it up without thinking, slipped it into my pocket, and walked back to the car. The moment we started driving again, something felt off. An uneasy, almost suffocating discomfort settled over me. I wasn't sick, but I felt wrong, like I had taken something that didn't belong to me, something that wasn't mine to claim. I kept glancing at the rock, and every instinct inside me screamed to put it back. I thought about telling my friend to turn around, but I didn't want to seem ridiculous or make a big deal out of nothing. So I stayed silent and tried to brush the feeling off. But it didn't go away. It only got worse. 2 words kept repeating in my mind, over and over, as if they were being whispered directly into my thoughts. You're cursed. The phrase played on a loop, growing louder with every mile. Then came the visions, dark, disturbing images flashing through my mind, things I would never normally think of, things too horrific to describe. These thoughts involved my friends, and they were so unnatural and twisted that I felt disgusted with myself for even having them. It was like something was trying to get inside my head, trying to plant these awful images. I stared out the window, holding back tears, desperately trying to push them away. My friends noticed something was wrong. They kept asking me if I was okay, but I just muttered, nothing, and stayed quiet. I didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding insane. I wasn't even sure what was happening myself. The feeling stayed with me for the entire drive, only starting to ease when we finally reached Deadwood. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted the moment we entered the town. I didn't want to think about the rock or the thoughts I had back in the car, so I forced myself to forget it. I didn't know what to do with the rock, but keeping it felt like a bad idea. Without telling anyone, I left it behind at the hotel before we checked out. Since then, I haven't felt that overwhelming sense of dread again. No more strange thoughts, no lingering darkness, nothing. Whatever it was, it didn't follow me. I still wonder about that day. Did I narrowly escape something? Was taking that rock a mistake? Why did I have those visions? Was it all just my imagination running wild, or was there something truly sinister at play? I don't know the answers, but one thing is certain. I'll never take anything from a place like that again. It was a regular Monday evening, just like any other. My friend and I had our usual meetup, but instead of playing video games, we decided to do something different. Explore an old abandoned building near his house. We had been there before, so we knew our way around pretty well. When we arrived, we slipped in through a broken window, which had once been covered with plywood but was now wide open. A bit of light seeped in, just enough for us to see as we moved through the building. Security sometimes patrolled the area, so we had to be careful not to get caught. We quietly made our way inside, wandering through different sections of the structure. There wasn't much to see, just the usual trash, graffiti, and broken furniture. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As we explored, my friend suddenly stopped and said he heard a door close somewhere in the distance. I hadn't heard anything, so I brushed it off and told him it was probably just his imagination. Still, we stayed alert, making sure we weren't about to run into anyone else. Eventually, we reached a stairwell leading down to the basement. I went first, carefully stepping down the old, creaking stairs. As I descended, I suddenly felt something, a hand touching my shoulder. A chill ran down my spine. I spun around instantly, expecting to see my friend, but he was several steps behind me, too far to have touched me. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. I hesitated before telling him. "I just felt something touch my shoulder. I thought it was you." He shook his head. "It wasn't me. Look, I can't even reach you from here." He stretched his arm to prove it, but there was no way he could have made contact. I forced a nervous laugh, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. We continued down the stairs and eventually reached the basement. The air was damp, and the silence around us felt heavy. To shake off the uneasiness, we joked around about our high school days as we moved through a series of empty rooms. Then, we found ourselves in a long hallway lined with massive pipes along the walls. They were bright orange, strangely out of place in the otherwise dull, decaying building. We had been there for quite some time by then, and decided to take a picture for social media. My friend, being the more photogenic one, volunteered to be in the shot. We positioned the camera at the right angle and took the picture. But when I looked at the screen, I froze. Right next to my friend, a dark shadow loomed. It wasn't a normal shadow. It was thick, almost solid-looking, with no clear source. My stomach twisted as I tried to make sense of it. I glanced around, trying to see if there was anything that could have cast that shadow, but there was nothing. My shadow wasn't in the frame, and there was no reason for something like that to appear. My friend noticed my reaction. "What is it?" he asked, leaning over to check the photo. I watched as his expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. His face grew pale. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. A cold sense of dread crept over us. My heart pounded. "Do you think it's a ghost?" I asked. He just nodded, his face still fixed on the screen. At that moment, an overwhelming feeling of disgust filled the hallway. It was a sickening, suffocating presence that made my skin crawl. A deep instinct inside me screamed that we needed to leave, immediately. "I'm getting out of here," I said, already turning toward the stairwell. I didn't wait for his response. I just moved fast. The next few minutes blurred together. Before we knew it, we were back at my car, sitting in stunned silence. We didn't say a word, just exchanged glances that carried the same unspoken thought. We had seen something that defied explanation. Finally, I exhaled and said, "Let's go grab something to eat. I need to get my mind off this." My friend nodded, still shaken, but relieved to be out of there. Since that night, we haven't really talked about what happened, but I know I will bring it up eventually. I still have the picture, and I keep looking at it, convinced that I captured something paranormal. No matter how much I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that building. When my mother was a teenager, outdoor activities were the main form of entertainment. Smartphones weren't popular yet, so kids spent their time playing tag, hiking, or just hanging out with friends. One day, my mother went on a jungle trek with her father, her oldest brother, and two of her female cousins, Rana and Lana. They were exploring the Taysek Meridun forests, but they didn't venture too deep. Her father made sure of that. At the time, they didn't question why he was so cautious. After about an hour of trekking, they came across a lake. It wasn't too big, but it wasn't small either. The water was a deep, murky green. Seeing a good resting spot, my grandfather decided they should take a break. They all sat on dry leaves or logs near the water. My mother and her two cousins chose a large log that extended slightly over the lake, steady enough for all three of them to sit comfortably. As they sat there, chatting about life, Rana absent-mindedly drummed her fingers on the surface of the log. That's when she noticed something odd. The wood felt damp, almost too damp. She glanced down and realized that the surface was covered in a slimy, mucus-like substance. Confused, she called out to Lana and my mother to take a look. They were puzzled. How could a log be covered in something like that? Curious, Lana shifted forward to get a better look, but the moment she moved, she nearly lost her balance. That's when they noticed something even stranger. The log wasn't just wet, it was slippery and wobbly. Sure, it made sense for something on the water to be unsteady, but the slick texture didn't seem right. That's when my mother turned to look behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a log at all. They had been sitting on the coiled body of an enormous snake, its massive form resting just above the water. Its head was tucked beneath the surface, but my mother could now see the slitted, reptilian eyes barely breaking through the water's surface, motionless but unmistakably there. A cold wave of terror swept through them. The three girls froze, afraid that any sudden movement might wake the beast. They couldn't scream. They couldn't move too quickly. And their grandfather and uncle, who sat with their backs to them, had no idea of the danger. They had to get off. Slowly, quietly, carefully, they began shifting backward, trying to slide off the snake's body without disturbing it. Every tiny movement felt agonizingly loud. But just as they thought they were making progress, Rana stepped on a dry branch. The sharp snap echoed through the silence. All three of them saw it. The slitted eyes shifted. They didn't wait. Terror took over, and they screamed as they bolted away, startling their grandfather and uncle. Without looking back, they ran as fast as they could, tearing through the jungle, hearts pounding, lungs burning, leaving behind everything they had brought for the trek. By the time they reached home, breathless and shaken, they told their grandfather what had happened. But instead of being surprised or alarmed, he simply shook his head, a bemused expression on his face. Then he told them about the 7 lakes hidden within the Taysek Meridun forests. Each one, he said, was protected by a Penungu, a supernatural guardian. According to his belief, they had unknowingly stumbled upon one of these mystical entities. Luckily, it hadn't harmed them. Perhaps because they had done nothing to provoke it. Even after all these years, my mother never forgot that day. The day they unknowingly sat on something that should never have been disturbed. The year was 2000. I was in my second year of high school in Malang, East Java. My school had its fair share of ghost stories, much like any other school in my city. But ours had an unsettling history. Before it became a school, the land was a cemetery during the Dutch colonial era. We had all heard the legends. They said the graves of wealthy and influential Europeans once filled the ground. In the 1970s, the cemetery was relocated. Some bodies were moved to another cemetery in the city, some sent back to Holland, and others reburied in a Christian cemetery in Sentong, about 2 kilometers away. After that, the land was repurposed into a soccer field, a swimming pool, a youth scout building, and eventually, my high school. That was when the ghost stories began. At first, I didn't believe them. Rumors of a ghostly government official on horseback, a blonde woman sitting on a garden bench, and a child lingering backstage in the school hall seemed like nothing more than urban legends. Our school wasn't even that old. It was built in the late 1970s. The truly haunted schools were the ones built during colonial times, right? That's what I thought. I was wrong. That day, my karate club was preparing for an upcoming competition. Our practice ran from 2:30 p.m. to around 6:30 p.m. We used a storage room backstage in the school hall as a changing room. Since the room belonged to the student council, we had to borrow the key from them. Before practice started, one of the student council members warned us. Don't use the room after Maghrib. Maghrib, the evening prayer, happens just after sunset, around 6 p.m. His warning was firm. When we asked why, he refused to explain, simply repeating that we must not be there after Maghrib. Among Javanese people, there's a belief that supernatural entities emerge at dusk, the moment when day shifts into night. We shrugged it off. After all, it was just a superstition, right? By the time practice ended, it was just past 6 p.m. We rushed back to the changing room, not really thinking about the warning. 3 of us girls went inside first to change. As we talked and laughed, we heard a giggle. It was faint, almost distant. We ignored it. The call to prayer, Adhan, from Maghrib rang out, echoing across the school grounds. That's when one of my friends remembered the warning. She urged us to hurry up, suddenly uneasy. We teased her for being scared, laughing it off. But as she glanced at the far corner of the room, her face changed. She froze. Then, without another word, she bolted out of the room. She didn't even finish changing. Before leaving, she yelled over her shoulder, "Lock the door when you're done!" We laughed at how terrified she was. It wasn't until we were almost done changing that we heard it again, another giggle. This time, we both went silent. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the room with us. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I exchanged a glance with my friend. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Then, the whiteboard leaning against the wall suddenly crashed onto the floor. Bang! We screamed. We bolted for the door. We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic set in. We banged on the door, screaming for help. And then we heard it again, the giggle. A child's giggle. But there were no children in the school at that hour. The more we screamed, the more the giggle continued. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, as if whoever it belonged to was enjoying our fear. After what felt like an eternity, our sensei arrived. The door unlocked easily from the outside. The moment it opened, we ran out, barely stopping to explain what had happened. The next day, I returned the key to the student council office. The same guy who had warned us asked casually, "Did the kid ghost mess with you?" I felt my stomach drop. He went on to explain that the ghost of a blonde-haired child haunted that room. He liked to tease people, especially those who ignored the warning to leave before Maghrib. That's why he had warned us in the first place. But we had been too careless to listen. Years later, I returned to my high school for a reunion. Out of curiosity, I asked some of the younger students about the kid ghost. Their reaction? "Wait, you've seen him too?" They told me he was still there, playing his usual tricks on students. Recently, I reached out to an Instagram account that shares stories about my hometown. I asked if the kid ghost was still in the school hall. The admin laughed. "Yeah, he never left. Even after the renovations. Even after all these years, he refuses to leave."